And Mayor Douglas, we're now live.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to start by acknowledging we're gathered here today on the traditional lands of the Coast Salish people. And with the quorum being present, I'd like to call this committee of the whole meeting to order. First item on the agenda is approval of the agenda. Could I get a motion to adopt the agenda as presented? Moved by Councillor Callio, seconded by Councillor Finley. Any discussion? All in favor and opposed? Motion carries. We now move on to the adoption of the minutes. We have before us the minutes from the July 11th and July 31st, 2023 meetings for adoption. Could I get a motion to adopt the minutes as presented? Moved by Councillor Toporowski, seconded by Councillor Callio. Any discussion? All in favor and opposed? Motion carries. We now move on to public input, and I'll ask IT staff to put the instructions up on the screen for virtual participants. And while that's happening, I'll now turn to the in-person attendees who have put their names forth on the sign-up sheet. So first I have Rhoda Taylor. And Ms. Taylor, if you could step up the podium and state your name and address. And I think, as you know, we've got a 3-minute speaking rule.
Thank you. My name is Rhoda Taylor. Am I going to do something? Press that button? Okay, good. I need instructions. Okay. My name is Rhoda Taylor. I live at 3346 Glacier Street in the municipality. I'd like to speak to the deferral of, or whatever the right term is, taxes for the House of Grace. I'd like to speak in opposition. While I do not contest the right of the House of Grace to exist, I do vigorously oppose the use of taxpayer dollars to support an organization which provides misinformation at a time when we have significant services already available in our community, such as Healthiest Babies Possible and the Margaret Moss Health Unit, among others. This is a misuse of taxpayer dollars. Those citizens who wish to support the House of Grace are more than welcome to do so, but my money should not be allocated to that agency. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll now turn to the next speaker on the list, Mary Annis. Ms. Annis, if you could state your name and address. Again, it's 3 minutes.
Thank you for allowing me to address the council. I understand the House of Grace is asking for property tax exemption on the basis that it provides a community benefit regarding fulfilling some basic need or improving the quality of life in the community. So addressing these criteria, first, the House of Grace does not provide a basic need, as we already have actual medical and health services which provide care and counseling for unplanned pregnancies by medical and health-trained counselors. They're professionals. The counselors at HOG misrepresent themselves by appearing to be a medical center, but they are not medical or health centers with appropriately trained and unbiased staff. Rather, the training is based on religion. Members of the group have read the manual pertaining to the House of Grace and other crisis pregnancy centers, and they're so-called counselors, and it is based on a fundamentalist religion with the view that abortion should not be an option for girls or women under any condition, even be it rape or incest. So I would like to say that in our community, we have adequate medical and health clinics to deal with any aspect of reproduction. And I'd like to point this out to you. This is a pamphlet that is put out by Public Health, and in that there are particular 2 sections that are devoted to reproductive health. And I'll leave some of these pamphlets here, just over here, so that you can have a look at them. Then the next thing, the second point I'd like to make is that according to the exemptions is House of Grace does not improve the quality of life here in the Cowichan Valley for girls and women. Rather, they seek to stop women from having an abortion by way of misinformation, by using scare tactics, telling vulnerable women that they use scare tactics in telling vulnerable women that if they have an abortion, then they will likely get breast cancer or they'll have miscarriages. And this is scientifically false. And they do tell women this when they're in a vulnerable state, and warn them against having an abortion.
Ms. Ennis,
Also,
we're
they
at
have-
time, but if you'd like to conclude that sentence.
That's it? Okay, can I just, therefore, this is indeed a harm in this that this organization does to girls and women in our community.
Great, thank you.
Oh, yeah.
I'd next like to invite Greg Gerbis up to the podium. Mr. Gerbis, if you could state your name and address. I mean, I've already stated your name, but I'm supposed to say that when you
My name
come
is
up.
Greg Gerbis. I live at 2540 Timbercrest Drive. Thank you very much for the opportunity. First item is permissive tax exemptions. $627,000, lady and gentlemen. That's a lot of money. And, you know, that might be about $60 per household, and we are talking about affordability. The other thing I'd like to bring to your attention is you need to jump into the weeds. This is $600,000. You need to jump into the weeds and look at it. There's stuff in there that, anyway. Second thing I want to talk about is the affordable housing. I can categorically state that there is a shortage of housing. No question. No question at all. The affordability issue is there, but the definition of affordability, it's all over the map. So people using affordable housing, it doesn't sit with me. The policy paper, Christina Hove, I hope I pronounced that right, and Chris Osborne, remarkable document, just a remarkable document. It's very, very complex and very hard to understand and will be to administer. And just remember, if you adopt a policy like this, you have to administer it. Targets. Are you talking about market housing, non-market housing? Are you talking about supportive housing, emergency housing, shelters, special needs housing? Not well defined. And even in the paper, the policy, it says this policy does not address housing supply and availability. So how are you ever going to know what you've achieved if you adopt the policy? How are you ever going to know what you've achieved if you don't know what the starting points are? The reserve fund, I refer you to 5A and 5B in the policy. You know, you're going to start buying and selling real estate. You're purchasing motels, hotels, rental apartments. You're going to do construction and operations of housing units. It's all in the document. Just scares the heck out of me. The financial incentives, the DCCs, the property tax exemptions that you're talking about, the user fee bylaw, the differential between water and sewer in certain instances, accessory dwelling units. Anyway, please remember it's taxpayer dollars. It's taxpayer dollars every time you dip into these, and you need to protect that.
We're at time, Mr. Gerbis.
How about one more minute? I just have one more thing, please.
My only worry is just the other speakers. Okay, if council's okay with it, but I'll invite the other speakers for an extra minute as well if they'd like to.
So this is not your sandbox. Market housing is driven by the market, 100%. The other housing is a provincial matter, BC housing. And the policy paper would fit quite well into their mission statement. and I'll read you their mission statement. BC Housing develops, manages, and administers a wide range of subsidized housing options across the province. We also license residential builders, administer owner buildings, authorizations, and carry out research and education that benefits the residential construction industry, consumers, and affordable housing. Hell of a mission statement.
Hey, Mr. Gervais, I hate to cut you off, but
Okay.
I gave you extra minute.
Okay, well, I'll write to you with the rest of it. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Just for consistency, I'd like to ask the other two speakers if they'd like to come up for another minute with your comments.
I will. I have a tendency
But if you go
to-
2 minutes, then I'm gonna have to invite Mr. Gervais
Well,
to
and
come
I
up
have a
for another
tendency to
minute.
be a bit concise, so I will go back to it. House of Grace is a crisis pregnancy center. They make no bones about it. It is an unlicensed pregnancy counseling center that conceals an anti-abortion agenda and provides counseling with lay-trained counselors, and the staff is not adequately and appropriately trained for what they portray themselves as. It is not something that this government should be involved in. Is their right to exist? I'm not contesting. I am contesting any money involved from this particular government.
Thank you. Ms. Annis, anything else to add?
I would just like to say that we have adequate health units, medical units, and I would encourage you to have a close look at this, which identifies those units. So the House of Grace is not fulfilling a need in the community.
Okay, thank you. I'll now turn to, Councillor Finlay.
Point of privilege, Mr. Mayor, why do we only allow 3 minutes? Is that one of our policies? Because I know in Nanaimo they do 5, and we have had those concerns from other speakers before, that 3 just isn't enough. I'm just curious.
It's in our councillor procedure bylaw, so like if any councillor wants to bring forward a notice of motion to change it, our corporate officer is asking us to.
Well, I'll do a survey.
Mr. Sorry, Councillor Toporowski.
It's part of the survey that council has right now. That would be a good input for staff.
Ted took the words right out of my mouth.
All right, so I'm now going to turn to IT staff and ask if there are any virtual attendees with their hands raised.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, there's one attendee with their hand raised, and I will unmute them right now.
Yeah, if you could
Go ahead.
state your name and address and the agenda item you'd like to speak to. Anybody there? All right, well, looks like
Are
we're
you able
having.
to hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. I'm unfortunately getting feedback. Council, the meeting is going on a parallel to us on some reason. So I'm not quite sure why that's happening. But okay. But
You're not
okay,
sure,
so
sorry. Yep.
My name is Joanne Hughes, and my address is 1088 Viewtop Road, and I'm here to talk about permissive tax exemption. So I just have 2 points. I'll be quick. I did submit a letter earlier to council. I just want to voice my concern for giving permissive tax exemption to Camp Kiwanis.
Oh, you still there?
Yeah, I am, but I can hear myself now talking. I'm getting a recording of the meeting playing at the same time that I'm speaking.
But perhaps mute your computer.
Okay, can you still hear me?
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, so I'd like to, so Camp Kiwanis recently has been deemed not appropriate environment for our public school children. 3 island school boards have canceled their partnership with the camp, because of their anti-LGBTQ beliefs. I've been looking at the CRA charity page for Camp Kiwanis. 2021, 2022, they made $6 million in revenue, or sorry, nearly $5 million in revenue. So I think that they don't need our $22,000 in tax exemption. And then the other one as well would be the House of Grace Pregnancy Center. I also do not think we should be supporting organizations that do not support a full range of reproductive health services. Again, they're requesting a small amount, so I don't think that would be insurmountable hardship on that organization if we deny them permissive tax exemption. So I just want to say that our community, we should be following the the provincial and federal human rights codes, and I think these organizations do not do that. So thank you very much for hearing me.
Great, thank you for the input. I'll now turn to IT staff one more time to ask if there are any virtual attendees with their hands raised.
There is currently no one with their hand raised.
All right, we can now move on to staff reports. Our first item here is 6.1, Introduction, Development, Economics, and Community Amenity Contributions Project. And I understand we're going to have a presentation, virtual presentation from George Parker from Mulholland and Parker Land Economists. But I will turn it over to planning staff to ask if they would like to introduce the presentation, if we'd like to move straight to Mr. Parker.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. We don't have much of an introduction. I think Mr. Parker's presentation will speak for itself, but this is really an introduction to the methodology and the study that he's conducting for us that will inform a potential future community amenity contribution policy. So really this is, I'll turn it over to George at this point. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mr. Osborne. Good evening, Mr. Parker.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here, first of all, and I'm glad that you can hear me and that I can hear you, because that wasn't true for the first 20 minutes.
Mr. Parker, you're a bit faint. Is there any way you could, I'm not sure, maybe speak a bit closer to the microphone, or if there's any way we could?
Sure. How about this?
I'll turn to council. Can you hear all right? Yeah, I'm seeing head nodding.
So if I go back to a more normal distance, how about now?
Yeah, that might be more comfortable for you. So I think I think that'll work.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, I might as well turn off my video if I'm going to be sitting like this, right? So that's okay. I'll do whatever works. So if I'm ever too quiet, just let me know and I'll see what I can do. So I have a PowerPoint presentation. Should I take control of it? I have it loaded on my computer here. Alternative, it looks like it's there. Okay, excellent. So my name is George Parker. I work for Mulholland Parker Land Economists, and let's go to the next slide just so that I can talk about the presentation. So the purpose of this presentation is to present some of the theory, practice, and methodology behind density bonusing and community amenity contributions, which in reality are two sides of the same coin. They are effectively the same policy, using different mechanisms to implement them, and I'll talk about that. So first I'll talk about my role, what I've been hired to do, the work that is ongoing. Then I'll talk a bit about the policy framework that enables density bonusing and community amenity contributions, which are prevalent but relatively new in the grand scheme of things. Both policy options have only been around for about 20 years. I'll talk a little bit about setting density bonusing and CAC rates, and about the underlying theory behind it, which is called land lift. And then I will talk a little bit about a common misconception that I often run into when dealing with planning departments and municipalities regarding CACs. And finally, I'll talk about the experiences of some other communities that have implemented these policies. Proceed with the slide, please. Okay, great. So I'm a land economist, which means I help clients understand development, typically in two ways. The first is market research, which is I gather quantitative and qualitative data about local markets. This might be residential, commercial, industrial, what have you. I want to understand important parameters like costs, prices, the pace of development, and get some perspectives from local experts, essentially. The other hat that we wear is financial analysis, which essentially means modeling using Microsoft Excel and similar tools to model the flow of money through a development project. So we can look at the revenues they will get and the costs they will accrue, and essentially identify things such as the appropriate land value that a developer would be willing to pay. That's a typical application of my work. Next slide, please. We use these techniques to answer questions such as, is a given type of development financially viable in a given location? How much land value would a particular land use support? What would be the anticipated economic impact of a particular development? And so on. Next slide, please. Specific to North Cowichan, we've been retained recently to perform both of these roles, both some research and some analysis for North Cowichan, with the overall aim of identifying supportable CAC rates. A similar project was performed by Coriolis in 2015. We are going to essentially update that work and look at the current market and see if there's room for any CACs in this development market. We conducted market research in August and submitted a market research report. This work included online research as well as interviews with 10 local experts, which included realtors, developers, and builders. Next slide, please. As we speak, I am currently in the process of creating a financial model looking at 18 different residential styles in each of North Cowichan's 5 urban neighborhoods. So that'll be a total of 90 scenarios. We look at the land values supported under each development scenario, and then by comparing them, we can determine the capacity of for CACs in North Cowichan. So that's essentially the broader project of which this presentation is one small part. Next slide, please. So first I'll talk about the policy framework that underlies these mechanisms. But what are they? CACs, community amenity contributions, and density bonusing are 2 mechanisms that allow municipalities to acquire neighborhood amenities in exchange for increased density. They are based on the same economic principle, which I'll talk about later, but they use different policy mechanisms to achieve the same effect. Next slide. So what kind of amenities are we talking about? The funds that are generated through these tools go towards things such as affordable housing, community facilities, park improvements, street beautification, fire halls, transit infrastructure, and so on. Next slide. So first I'll describe what density bonusing is. Density bonusing is codified directly into the zoning bylaw. It is part of the parcel zoning and does not require rezoning to be used. Typically, the zoning will specify 2 densities, a lower density that may be developed as of right with no contribution, and a higher maximum density that may be developed if a contribution is paid. Density bonusing is, go to the next slide, please, just to see if it, okay. So it's expressly permitted, I have some speaking notes, but I'm not in control of the slides, so it's kind of guesswork as to whether they match up perfectly or not. So it's density bonusing is expressly permitted by the Local Government Act, Section 482, which I have a text copy of here. But essentially, it says that a zoning bylaw. Next slide, please, just in case it's written there. Okay, it isn't. But I'll talk about section 482 anyway. It says that a zoning bylaw may establish a different density regulation for a zone, one generally applicable for the zone, and the other or others to apply if the applicable conditions under paragraph B are met, and the conditions may entitle the owner to a higher density. So amenities, this may be in exchange for cash or in-kind amenities. So that's how density bonusing works. It's built into the zoning. The other tool is community amenity contributions. So CACs are the product of negotiation between a developer and the municipality. This takes place during the rezoning phase. So if there's no rezoning, then there's no grounds for CACs. There is no legal opportunity for CACs to be negotiated. The power to do this is not expressly granted by any statute, but it is considered an automatic extension of the municipality's power to legislate zoning. Because zoning bylaws are bylaws, that means they're discretionary. That means that there is no limits on what negotiations a council may enter into with a landowner to provide them with a rezoning. And so what that creates is an opportunity to acquire the funds for some amenities or some in-kind amenities. So that is the underlying legal basis for it. Next slide, please. So the implication of in other words, if the zoning does not already include a density bonusing component, then rezoning is required to get any kind of contribution. If you haven't already built density bonusing into your zoning bylaw, CACs are the only opportunity. Municipalities can't just ask for a contribution without offering some benefit in return. Typically some densification or intensification of use. But the two approaches rely on the same economic principles, which I will talk about now. Next slide, please. So what should determine the size of this contribution? Is there an appropriate size? There are two approaches to determining this. The first is a basket of goods approach, and the second is a land lift approach. Next slide, please. So in the basket of goods approach, the cost of all desired amenities in a neighborhood is calculated and then divvied up between the applicable projects. So this treats amenities much like DCCs. In a DCC framework, the required servicing for your community or for a portion of your community is calculated by engineers and then divvied up on a per square foot or a per unit or even a per acre basis and applied to developments, typically at rezoning or at the development permit step. You can take the same approach with amenities, and that is what the basket of goods approach describes. Next slide, please. The other approach is called the land lift approach, and this measures the size of the contribution by analyzing the project itself and calculating how much the project can afford to pay. Next slide. Each approach has its pros and cons. I think, so just to summarize this here, the basket of goods approach bases the size of the contribution on the purpose of the contribution. If you need a particular park improvement and it costs this much, then that's how much we'll charge. Whereas the land lift approach is based on the contribution's source. Which developments are paying for it? How much can they afford to pay? Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, each approach has its own pros and cons. The basket of goods approach, which is based on a particular wish list that's determined in advance, has the following advantage. It is more defensible and has better optics, by which I mean it is all clearly stated in advance, the objective, the target amenities that are to be acquired through development, and then those are costed and applied to development in a way that appears equitable and everyone prefers the defensibility of this approach. But there are some disadvantages. In practice, there is really no limit to potential amenities, so this approach gives little guidance. This is particularly true when you contemplate affordable housing. The scope of the housing shortage in this province is such that no amount of affordable housing provided by a municipality will satisfy the latent demand. And so there really is no upper limit on the possible size of our quote-unquote basket of goods. The other disadvantage of the basket of goods approach is that that basket may be too large. There's only a certain amount of development potential in a neighborhood. There's only a certain amount of land lift in the rezoning process, something I'll talk about later. And so there's a risk with the basket of goods approach that the municipality may ask for too much and overburden development and disincentivize it or prevent it. Next slide, please. As for the land lift approach, this approach is based on a development's ability to pay. It has the advantage that the rate can be rationally and strategically determined to maximize public benefit and minimize developer risk, by which I mean, if we calculate the amount that a development can afford to pay, then we make sure, or rather we can ensure, that it's not too much. It doesn't prevent development. It also allows us to calculate the maximum amount that we're able to get for these effectively bottomless objectives such as affordable housing. The disadvantage, of course, is that a developer would claim it's unfair that the maximum amount is being extracted from each development. And that is an example of bad optics. Next slide, please. So since the two approaches both have pros and cons, it is our opinion that the best approach is to combine them. You should perform a land lift calculation to make sure you're not overburdening development. At the same time, you should do some work coming up with a basket of amenities, a basket of goods that you'd like to pay for, so that the objective of these CAC funds is communicated clearly in advance, and everyone knows where the money is going. Next slide, please. So, on to land lift, a term I have used and that some of you may know, but I will describe it. Since contributions are always voluntary and developers always have a lower density option that doesn't require a payment, there is a point at which the bonus density won't be worth it to the developer, i.e., they have an existing zoning, they are contemplating rezoning the property to a new use. But if the CACs are too high, there will come a point when they'd rather just stick with the existing zoning. And that amount can be calculated. Next slide, please. So consider the following equation. Revenue minus project costs minus profit equals the land price. The money for community amenity contributions has to come from some combination of these four items. Either the developer will need to get more revenue to pay for it, have fewer costs, less profit, or pay less for the land. Let's go through these items individually and take a look. Next slide, please. So, the price of a condo or the rental rate of commercial property are set by the market. The price of an apartment is the price of an apartment. Developers already set these prices to maximize revenue, with or without a CAC. So these prices cannot simply be increased to cover the CAC amount. Because if the developer could have made more revenue by changing these and increasing them, they already would have. We have to assume that since developers are rational, they will have already set their revenues as high as they feasibly can given market conditions. Therefore, the contribution does not come from increased revenue. CACs do not make products more expensive for the end user, but they might kill projects if they're too great. Next page, please. Project costs. These include construction costs, as well as soft costs such as architect fees, DCCs, and so on. Once again, these are set by the market or by policy in the case of things like rezoning fees and so on. The developer will spend as little as possible to minimize costs, with or without a CAC. So these costs cannot simply be decreased to make up for the CAC amount. If the developer could reduce costs, they already would have. So therefore, along similar reasoning, we have to assume that the contribution does not come from the decreased project cost. Next slide, please. Profit. Although technically this can be decreased somewhat to account for the CAC, in practice there is a lower limit. Developers expect to make a certain amount of profit for a project of a certain size, and financiers will insist because they need to be assured of a project's viability before they're willing to lend. And so profit cannot in practice really be reduced beyond a certain minimal level. Next slide, please. And so by process of elimination, the CAC amount mostly comes out of land costs. Essentially, a CAC of $1 million results in a lower land price of about $1 million. Now, this only works, of course, if the developers know in advance that they'll be expecting to pay $1 million for CACs, and so they won't be willing to spend as much to acquire the property. And that's one of the main reasons why CAC rates should be published well in advance, so developers have the opportunity to account for them in their own budgeting process. This is true for exactly the reason that land price is usually treated as a residual in pro forma analysis, namely that the other parts of the equation are out of the control of the developer, whereas the amount they negotiate for the purchase of the land is not. It's theoretically true, but it's also practically true. In jurisdictions with long-established CAC policies, the land prices have adjusted to reflect expected CAC costs. The greater the CAC expectation, the lower the land price, all else equal. Next slide, please. So now that we've determined that CACs always come out of the land value, we can address the question, what is the correct CAC rate? Remember that density bonusing and CACs are always voluntary. If the size of the contribution is too large, the developer can always proceed with the as-of-right density. This may be lower, but at least it requires no contribution. So, sorry, I just want to know exactly where we're going with this. I think what happens here is I'm showing you that let's say there's a certain amount of land value that the developer will be willing to pay for the existing zoning. That's represented on the left there. And there's a higher land value that the developer will be willing to pay for the new density, the proposed density. Next slide, please. So the difference between the two is the land lift. In other words, the land lift is the difference between what the developer will be willing to pay if it was already rezoned and what they'd be willing to pay if they had to build according to the current zoning. Next page, please. Yes. So you see the argument here is if that CAC, if they only paid the left-hand amount for the land, then the community should be financially able to take that difference as a CAC amount. Next slide. So in summary, land lift, represents the maximum size of an amenity contribution. Okay. Next slide, please. Land lift is always created whenever land is rezoned. Without a CAC mechanism of some kind, this land lift is split between the developer who buys the land and the previous landowner who sells it to them. Next slide. Now, there's nothing wrong with this land lift amount going to the previous and new owners of this property. Letting these market participants benefit from rezoning directly financially has the advantage of giving landowners an incentive to support higher density development, since they stand to benefit from the speculative value. Next slide. However, this new value is the direct result of a change in zoning, the community's policy. It is not a result of the previous landowner's labor, all they did was wait, and it's also not a result of the developer's labor. The value they add comes later, and you can see the creation of that value in the difference between the value of the vacant property and the value of the finished product. Next slide. So the argument goes, why shouldn't the community reclaim this value created through legislation? And since it is a discretionary choice, they have the legal right to do so. Why shouldn't new development fund the creation of the amenities it necessitates, such as fire halls, parks, and so on? The risk, of course, in becoming dependent upon CACs and indeed DCCs is that financing necessary infrastructure and services through growth creates a requirement of growth. It creates a bit of a treadmill where you cannot stop growing lest you lose funding for the desired amenities, infrastructure, and so on. Yeah, next slide, please. I should point out now that even when CACs are used to pay for infrastructure and amenities, there is usually still an assist factor. Property taxes from existing development pays a share as well, which makes sense, as it will typically benefit from the new infrastructure and amenities. Next slide, please. Now, most municipalities don't ask for 100% of the land lift, but in the range of 25 to 75%. And we would recommend this as well. This has the following advantages. First of all, these CAC rates are based on models. They're based on financial models, and models can be incorrect. And so having a bit of a margin there where the amount that the community is seeking is less than the land lift means that if the models are wrong and we reduce the risk of going over that critical land lift amount and discouraging development. It also leaves a certain amount of land lift on the table for property owners and developers, which is an incentive to support development. Next slide, please. Now, there are two approaches to calculating land lift on in practice. The first is site analysis. So that means you actually do a profile of the specific site's characteristics, and you calculate the land lift on a site-by-site basis. Let's see if this is a pros and cons situation. Next slide, please. Okay, it is. Now, site analysis is technically preferable and more accurate, but because you have to do the analysis for every single redevelopment, it's also time-consuming and costly. So Victoria does this, for example. When a property is rezoned in Victoria, every single site that gets rezoned in Victoria has to do its own site analysis. A professional is hired to do that, and they calculate the land lift when going from the old zoning to the new zoning. Developers also find it unpredictable because they would rather know the CAC rate in advance so they can make more accurate business decisions. That brings us to the other approach. Next slide, please. The other approach is so-called blanket rates. So essentially what this means is you do a set of generic analyses, you figure out generally what your land lift rates should be, and then you apply those rates to all redevelopments. So this has the disadvantage of being less accurate because some sites will have more land lift and some sites will have less land lift in practice. But it creates more developer confidence because these are published rates and they know going in what the rates are and they can accommodate them in their planning. If you take a blanket rates approach, it should be updated every 2 to 5 years as market forces will fluctuate, prices and costs will change, and so on. Next slide, please. Amenity contributions can take the form of cash or in-kind spending, but affordable housing on site can also be a CAC. So essentially, instead of increasing costs, this decreases revenue, but the impact on land value is the same. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about a common misconception when dealing with CAC rates. The question is this: if you increase the density of a development by a certain the common misconception is that increasing the density of development by a certain proportion causes the residual land value to increase by the same proportion. So, for example, if we increase the density by 20%, many people would think that this should cause the land value to increase by 20%. But this is not true. Next slide, please. It's not. But many CAC policies in BC that I've run into treat this as a given. In truth, there is no consistent relationship between density and residual land value. Next slide, please. So it might look like this, where it increases linearly, and as you get more density, you get more land value. That would be a perfectly proportional growth there. This is what many people assume, but it also might look like this. Next slide, please. So this might be a situation where there are a lot of fixed costs, but as you add density, those fixed costs make a smaller and smaller portion of your overall costs. So you make more profit, disproportionate to the density. That's not uncommon if there's, say, servicing costs that are on a per acre basis, for example. Next slide. You could also have a pattern like this, where you get diminishing returns. This is also not uncommon. If I'm building a 200-unit apartment building with its strata, and I can only sell 100 units a year, then that 200-unit building represents 2 years of absorption. If I add 1 unit, well, that's only going to add a unit that I have to build now, but I have to wait 2 years to sell it. And consequently, you'd get diminishing returns on larger projects. And this is something that we see. Next slide, please. This is another pattern that's not unusual where you get benefit from density up to a point, and then you get a significant reduction in land value at a certain critical threshold, followed by increases once again. A great example of this would be wood frame versus concrete apartments. Typically, concrete apartments are more expensive to build than wood frame. And so when you go from 6 stories, which is the highest you can go in wood frame, to 7 stories, which is concrete construction, you actually get a reduction in land value, even as your density is increasing. And so you need to increase density quite a lot before you suddenly get more land value there. So that's why you don't often see apartment buildings between 7 and 8 stories. You typically need to get to maybe 10 or 12 stories before concrete really beats wood as far as land value. Next page, please. So if doubling the size of the project simply doubled the cost and revenues, that would be true, that common misconception. But the reality is more complicated. Next slide, please. So we've talked about this a bit. I think I was speaking on the wrong slides here, but I guess I'll just go over it again. Economies of scale. Some cost items don't scale to density. So for example, a DCC that is proportional to the land area, or a traffic or commercial study, you would need to pay the same amount no matter how dense the development is. And so you'll tend to get increasing benefits with density, looking like this. Next slide. That one. Next slide. Diminishing returns, we talked about that. That's where you get to a point where each additional unit or square foot helps you less than the previous one, looking like this. Next slide. And next slide after that. I talked about wood frame versus concrete, and that's the one that looks like this. Next slide. Okay, great. And next slide, please. So the implication of this is that the shape of that curve depends on so many factors that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. In no community will it be actually accurate to say the CAC that should arise from a square foot of development is this much, and that amount should be applied to townhomes and concrete apartments and wood frame apartments and commercial. That is almost certainly the wrong approach, because the amount of land lift generated really depends on the kind of development that we're talking about. In practice, it's often better to have tiers with different rates. So that might look something like this. Next slide. So this is just a random example that we made up. But for example, you might have something like between 2 and 3 FSR, it's $100 per square foot. But between 3 and 4 FSR, you have to switch to concrete, and so there's no residual land value. There's no land lift between as you climb that density scale. And then once you exceed 4 FSR, you get $200 per square foot, and then once you exceed 5 FSR, you get $250 per square foot. Again, these are somewhat absurd high densities for North Cowichan, but the point remains that there may be a non-linear relationship between density and land lift. Next slide, please. So, in summary, I'm going to talk a little bit about other communities' CAC and density bonusing policies. This is a selection of 12 communities, all of which have some form of density bonusing or CACs. This is real research that we performed, but it is a little bit out of date. This table is from 2019, but I'm throwing it in here as a freebie and as an interesting piece of comparative information. So these are mostly communities from the Lower Mainland. We've got Surrey, Richmond, Coquitlam, the Township of Langley, District of North Vancouver, Maple Ridge, City of North Vancouver, White Rock, and Pitt Meadows. We've got Abbotsford in the Fraser Valley. We've got Kelowna in the Okanagan, and Langford. There's no particular reason for these. We selected them because they were mid to large size communities with, in most cases, decades of history using at least one of these two policy formats. Next slide, please. So some communities, the communities that we looked at were split largely evenly 3 ways between communities that just had density bonusing, so they only acquire amenities through their zoning bylaw, and rezoning is not required. There's such as Richmond, such as Surrey, Abbotsford, and Kelowna. We have communities shown in yellow that don't have density bonusing but do have a CAC policy. Township of Langley, District of North Vancouver, Pitt Meadows, and Langford. And many communities had both, Richmond, Coquitlam, Maple Ridge, City of North Van, and White Rock. Next slide, please. So what's the basis? Now, when I say basis, what I mean is in communities where a set of rates have been published, are these rates that apply on a per unit basis, on a per built area basis, on an FSR basis, and so on? And the answer is pretty much all over the place. Some are per unit, some are per built area. But I've noticed here that if built area is used, then FSR steps are usually also applied so that we get that benefit of having different rates at during different density intervals. And that allows us to not kill a project just because it happens to be a relatively small concrete development. Next slide, please. There's also the question of which objectives, what is the destination of these funds and amenities? What is the purpose of these CACs? So the 3 communities that we've got highlighted here are mostly focused on parks and facilities, but that is really a minority of the communities that we looked at. Next slide, please. Another minority option is to incentivize underground parking. both Abbotsford and Langford were struggling to get the amount of underground parking that they wanted. They would rather have underground parking than above ground parking, which is detrimental to the public environment and also not a great use of space. Next slide, please. These green items here are all of the municipalities that we looked at that prioritize affordable housing, or at least have affordable housing as one of the amenities that they're focusing on. This is a few years old, and I would not be surprised if even more communities were focusing on this critical policy objective now. Next slide, please. Then there's the question of eligibility, by which I mean what kinds of developments qualify for the CAC or density bonusing policy. The blue items, the blue municipalities shown here, only have a CAC policy in certain for certain land uses or in certain parts of their municipality. It's more specifically focused. Whereas the yellow items, which is the majority, those municipalities apply their CAC policy to all rezonings. Next slide, please. And finally, we asked planners from each of these municipalities whether they considered their CAC or density bonusing policy to be a success. For the most part, everyone was happy about it. They believed it had at least somewhat achieved its objectives. But what we did notice is that certain municipalities said no, it was not successful. And these were cases where they simply didn't see developer uptake. In the case of Kelowna, this was due to the policy's focus on underground parking. The incentive generated by the extra density simply was not enough to render the underground parking financially viable. It's a very expensive place to build underground parking, apparently. And as for Pitt Meadows and Abbotsford, this was another common, this one's quite a common case where the existing zoning is already quite attractive to developers. And therefore, there is very little interest in rezoning, and therefore there's no uptake of these policies that would generate some extra revenue upon rezoning. So that is it. Next slide, please. I think we're done though. Okay, I think we're done. So I might as well keep the slideshow up just in case it's helpful, but I'm happy to take questions now.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Parker. That was a informative and refreshing take on the relationship between development, land prices, and community amenity contributions. And you've been at this table now 9 years, and I wish we'd got this presentation from you when I first started, because yeah, great information that'll inform our decisions going forward. I see one hand up here. Councillor Justice has a question for you, and I'm going to open up to all the council. I got a few questions myself as well.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. Is it Mr. Parker or Dr. Parker?
Mr. Parker.
Mr.
I
Parker.
just happen to be wearing it. I'm just wearing a tie.
Thanks. Lots of really interesting and important material here. I have a couple of questions that I'd like to start with, if that's okay. In one of your land lift slides, you say that revenue is set by the market, and if the developer could charge more, they already would have. I've often heard people argue that developers simply add community amenity charges onto the cost of the product, and thus passing those costs on to the consumer and only making things less affordable. But you're saying that, I think you said that CACs do not make products more expensive for the end user, which I believe is the same as saying that the market and nothing else determines the selling price. Is that correct? Can you speak to that?
I believe it is correct theoretically. However, in practice, developers may attempt a variety of strategies, and they may settle for the compromise position of setting their prices a bit higher than they should, which means their product won't move, they'll have to wait longer, and so they'll actually end up paying higher costs because they're carrying that debt for longer. But I would suggest that in this market, given how high interest rates are, it is probably particularly true that if they could, they want to move their product as fast as possible, and if they could charge more for it and still move it quickly, they already would have. And so, no, I believe that it's probably never been more true in BC that the market is setting prices, and you can't just pass along all your costs to the consumer. For example, look right now at what's happening with prices in North Cowichan. I have researched the local market, as I mentioned, and what we see is that for the last couple of years, prices are actually stagnated or even gone down. That's just because the households that are interested in purchasing properties or renting properties, with inflation, they simply can't afford to pay more. And with interest rates, they're paying more for their mortgages and so on. And so there is fundamentally, there's a revenue side that is imposed by conditions, and there's nothing the developers can do about it. So we see revenues dropping right now in North Cowichan during a period of rising costs. If costs were passed on to consumers at all times, then you would see prices and costs rising and falling in lockstep. That is not what you see. Next question, or does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you for that. I do have one more question, if I might.
Yeah.
In one of the slides, it was on page 35 on our agenda, but that probably won't mean much for you. You say that assuming the developer did not pay too much for the land, that they should be willing to part with some of the land lift in order to access the higher density option. But what if they did pay too much? I mean, I'm thinking about the case of the Bell McKinnon area here, where land values rose really dramatically when the local area plan was made public. And prior to any rezoning, which in many cases, in fact, the majority of cases has not been done already. So you say the land lift is always created whenever land is rezoned, but it is also created by local area plans and official community plans, it would seem. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Right. So there's a distinction I would make between residual land value and speculative value. And the difference is this. Residual land value is dependent upon the currently legal use on a site. You can purchase a site and you can build on that site according to its existing zoning. Although an OCP is a suggestion, and a very good one for the most part, because a municipality has no legal obligation to rezone to fit that OCP, then when a developer buys land and pays an amount for it that would be reflective of its OCP designation rather than its current zoning, they are taking a risk. They are gambling on the assumption that a rezoning, A, will occur, B, will occur without too many additional costs accruing, and will occur on a timely basis. It would be, whereas if you pay an amount for the land, and so it's speculative. Whereas if you pay an amount for the land that reflects what you're legally allowed to do with it now, that is a much less speculative component. If these theories are correct, and obviously there's always in reality noise and mess and complications, but our basic argument would be that if there are CAC rates that are published in advance and they match land lift, then the amount that land will trade for will be reflective of its current zoning rather than its proposed zoning under the OCP.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that.
There's one more point I would say, which is that developers are private industry and they take risks, and it's not necessarily the obligation of public bodies to protect them from those risks. But those public bodies may want to for a variety of reasons. And that's one of the reasons why we recommend that municipalities not pursue 100% of land lift, but something between 25% and 75% of land lift. Yeah, and that they do the kinds of analyses that we're doing right now to make sure that land lift even exists. It is entirely possible. Here's an example. Let's say that the amount you can get for townhomes and the amount it costs to build those townhomes do not work. It is not viable. It costs more to build a townhome than you'll get for it. No profit. In that situation, there is no land value. And if there's no land value, there is no land lift. And the kind of analysis I'm currently doing right now in North Cowichan will protect you from that outcome where you are looking for CACs in situations where that CAC will accomplish nothing but discouraging development. Okay, next question.
Yeah, any other council members with questions? Yeah, Councillor Manhouse and Councillor Finlay.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Mr. Parker, for your presentation. I do agree with you totally that the market sets a price. I have no qualms about that at all. I'm a free market enterpriser myself, and where government should not be stepping in and setting prices any which way. However, if the market sets price and the prices go too low, developers will not build.
That's
and that
right.
will make our supply even worse. Homelessness even worse. So I do agree with the market does, but market sets a price. But also with if you add no more CNCs to the developer while the prices are low, it's gonna restrict building.
I agree.
And people will go somewhere else where they can, where they get a better deal on CACs and lifts and stuff. So.
Oh, quite so. And right now is a very risky time. There are extremely high costs, not just to purchasers of property, but to developers who, in some part, finance their project through debt. And now that they're paying, 5% more on their interest than they were 2 years ago, it's a very expensive time to do anything. Simultaneously, those very same high interest rates and a variety of other senior government policy has made it quite expensive to buy finished product for households that are looking to buy housing. And so prices right now in North Cowichan are stagnant, if not dropping. And so it is extremely risky right now to increase developer costs through CACs or any other mechanism. And that's exactly why I am doing this financial analysis to make sure that we don't, or at least to help advise you to avoid adding burdens that are too onerous for today's market.
Councillor Finlay.
Mr. Parker actually answered my question I was going to ask, so I'm fine, thanks.
Councillor, before I come back to you, Councillor Jess, I'll just ask if there's any other council members who haven't spoken yet. All right, over to you.
Oh, thank you for indulging me a third question. Mr. Parker, your charts comparing different communities' CAC and density bonusing policies in those jurisdictions show that those funds are directed at a great number of objectives, including police, fire, library, parks, public art, childcare, as well as affordable housing. Do the jurisdictions that you looked at, do they typically have some sort of formulas for divvying up whatever amounts that they can negotiate amongst those particular objectives?
Yeah. So for example, I've done work in City of North Vancouver recently. And so they have a specific set of funds. They have an affordable housing fund, they have a community amenity fund, and they, for each dollar of CACs that they get from development, there is a set distribution, I believe it's 75%, 25%, that goes into each of those funds. And that information is all published in advance, essentially.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Councillor Mann asked, then I'm gonna ask some questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And my question is more to maybe to Mr. Conway, actually, Rob Conway, planner. FSR, there was a table here on FSR range. What's our average FSR in the growth area, in the Bell McKinnon area?
The local area plan, I believe, talks about, in the high density part of the Bell McKinnon plan area of, if I remember correctly, 1.8 to 2.5, something in that range. Most of the projects, none of the projects we've seen to date meet that requirement. They're not able to reach the density, the maximum FSR density, because of requirements for on-site parking and the height limitations and other regulations within the plan. So we've only had, I would say, well, we've had two approved projects, and we have some other ones that we're talking about. They're probably more in the range of 1.2, 1.4, something in that range.
That's a lot of unused. It's a lot of unused space. Mm-hmm. That's not used.
Sorry, can I just say something?
Yep.
I don't want anyone to look at my slides or tables and look at the specific FSRs that I was using and draw anything from that. These are all generic graphics that kind of show the basic concept, and you really wouldn't see FSRs above 4 or 5, even as high as 4 or 5, except in downtown cores. You'd expect an FSR of 4 or 5 on a high-rise building. So don't look at 2.5 FSR and think that's low density. It's not.
No, I'm not.
It's just my graphics.
Yeah, Ms. Parker, I was just asking a general question because I know that I've been talking to developers and stuff, and with all our requirements, it's just not feasible to do projects and then add CACs on top of it and everything else on top of it. So, FSR of 1.2 is just not feasible.
All right, Mr. Parker, I had some questions for you. First one I want to start with is, we're hearing arguments at the federal, provincial, local level about increasing supply as a way to address these skyrocketing housing costs we've seen in recent years. And I think the challenge some of us are seeing locally is that no matter how much we build, we're not just selling this to a local market or a regional market. There's I think the stats are about well over 60% of our sales are going to people from, Vancouver, Calgary, Ontario, other parts of the country, which obviously has its benefits, but does create challenges in that if we, the more we increase supply, it just seems like there's never-ending demand from outside this community. And wondering if you could comment on that, perhaps not so much on the provincial or national context, which might be a bit different dynamics, but more on the local context on that relationship between the supply of housing and how that impacts prices.
Yeah, I'd be happy to speak to that. So, first of all, supply is the issue. There is a shortage. If you want to house more people, you'll need to have more homes. But we'd point out that the housing shortage driving the housing crisis is provincial and national or even international in scale rather than local, and that no single municipality is large enough to solve the problem alone. It's not that supply isn't the issue, it is. It's just that shortage is nationwide. North Cowichan or any municipality is simply not big enough to solve Canada's problem on its own. And that's the truth. The solution will require increased supply, but it has to be increased supply at a large scale. It has to happen all over the province and all over the country, but especially all over the province, because BC is, even in Canada, an expensive place to live. BC is an unusually expensive province in which to get housing in Canada. So yes, supply is the problem. No, a municipality is not, individually big enough to solve that problem. It will require coordination at a large scale between many municipalities. And fundamentally, it's a collective action problem. And this is one of the reasons why the provincial government is looking at, making decisions from on high to increase density, to force an increase of density at the municipal scale. Within enough municipalities simultaneously to actually move the needle on shortage. Does that answer your question?
Sorry, carry on.
No, I was just saying, does that answer your question?
No, that's very helpful, and this I might be straying a bit too far from the topic at hand, but one of the concerns I've heard raised is that we can increase supply, and there's, as you explained, the logic about doing that on a national scale, helping address these challenges with the market, but that if there isn't that sufficient skilled trade supply, worker supply, and also materials, that increasing supply could have other impacts by increasing labor costs and increasing material costs, which could negate any potential savings that you would normally see when you're increasing the supply of goods in a market with the intent of price reductions is the ultimate goal.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say that a real approach that will work will have to require many industries at that table to essentially streamline the process and to focus those resources where they need to go. There are tricks, prefabrication, mass rezoning to reduce, the rezoning times and so on, the approvals. That all takes a great deal of time, and it is a huge cost because of the interest costs that developers are bearing. And so there are tricks that could be used to expedite it in the physical world and in terms of time. But fundamentally, yes, you're right. There will be, if zoning weren't the issue, then labor costs and material costs may indeed be the limiting factor on how rapidly this country can increase that housing supply. But that really, it starts getting outside of the scope of certainly this discussion, and also my particular area of expertise, which is really financial models.
Yeah, no, of course. The other question, just building on the previous question from Councillor Justice, is the Bell McKinnon area, which I know you're looking at as part of your study. First we had the announcement of the new hospital in 2016, and then by 2018 the local area plan. And as was pointed out, very few of these properties have been rezoned for higher density, yet the land prices have skyrocketed. And I mean, looking back at, hindsight's always 2020, and I was a member of council at the table, so I was in as much of a position as anyone to maybe take a bit of a different approach here. But is there a way that we could have, as a municipality in that case, or perhaps in future local area plans as we develop them, use some of these community amenity contribution policies to kind of temper the speculation in the market? Because my sense is if Bell McKinnon, for example, and again, maybe there's other local area plans we want to take this as well, if we had said explicitly in there that we're going to want X amount of affordable housing, specify what kind of streetscapes improvements we want, parks, infrastructure improvements. Not that we don't mention any of that in our Bell McKinnon local area plan, but if we had been a bit more prescriptive with it, my sense is perhaps that could have tempered some of the speculation. Or is it just like when a community gets a new hospital, this is kind of what happens with surrounding land values?
Well, okay, so to answer your question, so CACs should do exactly what you're describing, where they will temper that speculative speculative jump in values, because the prospective developer will recognize that that jump in value will largely be taken away through CACs, and so they can't afford to spend. They can't afford to pay for this land as if it had its new zoning. They only afford to pay what it would support under its current zoning, and then maybe a little bit more than that. But here's the thing. It needs to be in advance. A CAC policy, let's say you developers purchase some land. They purchase it with speculative value. Why shouldn't they? As at the moment, there is no CAC policy to take that value back from them. They have no reason to expect they will lose that value that they've purchased. And so then if a CAC program is rolled out, it takes them by surprise. spoils the project. This is why we always recommend that even if we identify a rate and we recommend that rate, that rate be gradually approached over the course of several years. So the market has the opportunity to accommodate that change in its planning.
Just
That is our recommendation.
with that point though, like if you're, so we'll just use this example of Bell McKinnon again. We have a local area plan, and while it didn't, I don't think it's maybe as prescriptive as it should be in terms of what the municipality wants in return. It does outline like all kinds of streetscape improvements. It specifies that the municipality's expectation is that development is going to pay for itself. Even when that was developed, we had a official community plan, our old one, that specified 10% of units in these major developments had to be affordable. So even though we didn't have an actual community amenities contribution policy, we did have other policies that if you piece them together, one would have hoped they could have tempered the market, but obviously didn't. Is there a risk that we could have a robust community amenity contributions policy, advertise it, but if speculators aren't paying attention to these policies, it's not clear to me how much that piece of paper we can wave around here at the municipality is actually in control of the market.
Well, I have a few comments on that. The first is that there's a pretty important psychological difference between qualitative information and quantitative information. It may be true that all of the amenities you advertised in that OCP would come with dollar figures, and in reality, there's a cost attached to them. But unless you've used a dollar figure and switched it into the quantitative realm, where a developer can actually incorporate it into their pro formas, they may ignore it simply because they don't see the dollar symbol. The other thing I would say is that in economics, we have this concept called the animal spirits. You'll have heard of a bear market or a bull market. The animal spirits are a reflection on the fact that although we have to model them as if they're rational, the participants in a market economy are not rational. They're just people. And they are not bound to always operate in a precisely rational way, especially because the future is unknowable. There's a certain amount of gambling going on here. And given that this is a market and purchasers are able to outbid one another, there is a natural tendency for the market to bid the price of land up through competition and through irrational exuberance. That's what it is. It is not necessarily the public sector's job to protect private industry from the risks of its own decision-making processes. But all you can do really is, advertise and clarify and make your dollar figures as clear as possible from the outset, so that they can be incorporated into developer pro formas and hopefully send accurate signals to the market.
Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful. I don't ask too many questions. I'll just one more, then I turn to Councillor Finley. But I think you mentioned in your presentation that whether it's community amenity contributions or density bonusing, it doesn't necessarily have to be blanket across the whole municipality. You can target certain areas or neighborhoods where you might want to provide more of an incentive for development and maybe ask for fewer amenity contributions, whereas others you might want to be a bit more strict and stick to what your perhaps original policies or vision may have been.
Sure, absolutely, and you see it all the time.
Great. Councillor Finley.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. One of the things, Mr. Parker, you said in your presentation was that there's always a risk of asking too much. And as a developer myself, I always look at that, and I always am concerned with community area contributions, community amenity contributions, because at the end of the day, developers can choose to build somewhere else. And so have you seen in your role where sometimes it has been too much and developers have moved on and communities are sitting with policies that just don't work for the development community?
Yeah, especially since the market fluctuates. So a CAC that may be appropriate in 1 year may be inappropriate the next year. I bet a lot of communities, I am confident, having, I study the market, this is my job, I am confident that many of the municipalities that had accurate, well-scoped CAC policies 5 years ago are in our current market with high borrowing costs, high construction costs, stagnating property values and prices, are now in a position where they're regretting those CACs. Maybe they're waiving them. It is discretionary, and nothing is preventing a municipality from saying we're calling a hiatus on CACs for the next, however many years while we get through the crisis. So I absolutely believe that happens and that CACs can be too high. If that wasn't true, then I wouldn't have anything to calculate.
Mr. Parker, by the same token though, couldn't CACs also be too low?
What does that mean though? Too low for what? The land lift amount that I calculate.
Sorry, carry on. I wasn't talking to you.
The land lift amount that I calculate is a ceiling. If you go above this amount, you'll kill the project. But there is no floor. The floor is 0. So if you want to charge less, charge less. You're not going to prevent development. You're not going to discourage it, and so on.
Yeah, but I think what I was speaking of was you spoke about not recovering some of these costs through the amenity contribution process, that you are passing this on to other taxpayers and creating this, never-ending cycle of growth to pay for previous improvements in infrastructure.
Yeah. So the question.
I think in that sense, perhaps it could be too low.
It could be too low in the sense that it doesn't pay for its development. In this sense, is not paying for itself. But not too low from an economic perspective, just too low from it's essentially a question of tax policy. Say you have certain amenities you've committed to, and you want to pay for them, and the CACs are not sufficient to pay for them. If you find yourself in a market condition where you can't support CACs at all, and that very well may be the case in North Cowichan right now. If you find yourself in that position, but you still want to pay for your amenities, then you must look to other sources, property tax revenue, and so on. And that, of course, increases property taxes, which is another burden that the community has to bear. But there's no free lunch, and that may simply be the case. Are the CACs too low, or is development simply not in a position right now to pay for it?
I think that gets into, values and priorities at the elected level, I would assume.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Fundamentally that is a political and policy question. At that point it kind of transcends economics.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Yeah, Councillor Calia.
Thank you, Mr. Parker, for your presentation. From what I'm gathering here is there's no lowest level you can have. You can go down to 0, and you go up as high as the market will bear. So, looking at your presentation, and it seems to me that wouldn't it be better just to have a fluctuating, depending on the market, depending on the year, depending on the time? I know that you in your examples, some of your examples here you had of different communities. Some of them have been charging, like you said, I think it was Victoria that was charging for, they were charging per project, and each individual project was being charged individually on its CACs. So I'm just watching your presentation, wouldn't it be better just to have a fluctuation and take the market every single year and have a look at what the CACs are for that year, especially in a market of what it is right now, a semi-stagnant market here in the Cowichan Valley?
Yes, that would be better. Once a year would be great. We usually recommend every 2 to 5 years. We haven't always seen the kind of dramatic, exciting changes that we've had in the last year with, inflation unlike anything we've seen in decades, and interest rates higher than anything we've seen in decades, and so on. Not every year will be as dynamic as this year, and so every 2 years should do, in most of the time. But yes, frequent review is ideal, and Victoria goes to the extreme by evaluating each project on its own. The risk there, of course, is that developers may look at that and say, I don't really know in advance what the CAC amount will be, and that makes me nervous, and I'm not as interested in working in that community because of the lack of certainty. So having some kind of published rate, I mean, certainly UDI recommends it, and that suggests to me that it will, developers like it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any further questions? Thank you, Mr. Parker, for the presentation.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure meeting you all. I look forward to presenting you with my results in a few months.
Yeah, looking forward to it as well. Thanks again.
Okay. Thank you, and have a great night, everybody.
Yeah, you too.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right, we'll now move on to the next item on the agenda. Item 6.2, Affordable Housing Policy, Public Engagement External Referral Report. Is that you, Mr. Osborne? Sylvie?
Good evening. So just briefly, the report that was presented to you summarizes in a little bit of detail and then a lot of detail the results of the public engagement that took place in July and August for the affordable housing policy. We've made a number of minor suggestions to revisions to the affordable housing policy, and then we've recommended that we hold off very temporarily on adopting the policy until we see the results of the study from George Parker. But happy to hear your thoughts on the engagement and answer any questions.
Great. Any questions from council? Councillor Finlay?
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I do have a couple concerns about the survey, and Councillor Manhas actually brought it up a while ago, but running the survey in the summer and the results of being only 137 respondents and only 2 builders or self-proclaimed builders. So I would be very interested in, I don't know if there's a way to put the survey back out there or some other engagement, especially in the development and the building community. If we've only got 2 builders that have had any sort of response on this policy, that does concern me. I think it's something that's going to affect the development community immensely, and I think it's definitely something we should do. And I'm just wondering if that's a possibility to, as part of this delay, I guess, in accepting this or pushing the affordable housing policy forward. Is there a way to connect with the development community a little further prior to coming back to council with the final version of the affordable housing policy?
Yeah, I mean, as a staff want to weigh in, but I would suggest that's perhaps more council's discretion, although I do understand as part of Mr. Parker's study, he is doing some focus groups with local developers. Mr. Swaby, anything?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. That would be exactly what I would have said, is that we'll seek council's direction on that, depending on how you handle the recommendation.
Mr. Manhas and Councillor Stash.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I have a real issue with what Mr. Gerber had said earlier in his public input about the municipality buying. Mr. Gerbis, sorry, Greg. Yeah, buying motels and hotels, and we've had history of in Victoria, the Cowichan Housing, BC Housing, buying hotels and motels in Victoria, Vancouver, and the disaster that's been. I don't think that should be part of this. We should not be in that business of buying hotels and motels and or any land for. It's a senior level government. Affordable housing, it belongs to senior levels of government, not to our local taxpayers. We're outside our lane when we deal with affordable housing. So I'm totally against this anyway, still, the affordable housing plan.
Councillor Stash.
Thank you, Your Worship. I just wanted to quickly touch on a report which did say it was a priority. I'm happy to see it again there. Again, I'll be listening closely at UBCM that hopefully even outside of the scope of the affordable housing policy, we can really address the short-term rentals sooner than later, and having a proper bylaw, and also the bylaw fees increased in relations that Tofino's done, Victoria's done, and I'm glad to see that the province is moving on it. So it is an urgency, and it's not against short-term rentals, but it's the losing of complete homes that were best suited for the long-term rental market.
So again, glad to see that staff still has that in there and shows it as one of the key importances. As for the other fine changes, I'm with it, and I'd also like to put the motion, move the motion to the floor.
So the staff recommendation? Yes. So it's been moved? Do we have a seconder? There's no seconder. Oh, a seconder? All right, it's been moved and seconded. So normally I go to use the first speaker because you moved it, but you spoke before making the motion, so I'm hoping to ask staff, I'll turn to you in a second, Councillor Finlay, but I just want to ask staff some clarification on the implications of delaying adoption of the policy until we get the report from the land economist. I think the report mentioned the land economist report is coming back in November. Do we have a sense of what that means for timing? Because I'm assuming we're going to get the land economist report and then an actual community amenity contributions at a subsequent meeting after that, or is it all happening in the same meeting?
Thank you. Yes, we're expecting the final analysis from Mr. Parker probably around late October, and that would form the basis for a subsequent potential CAC policy, depending on what the report says. But obviously at that point you would have the information in hand to know what the impact would be in terms of the affordable housing policy. And as part of that work, Mr. Parker will also be conducting a specific focus group session with realtors and developers in the local area as part of that research. So there will be some additional development sector input.
Turn you to say Councillor Finley's hand was up earlier. And perhaps my question, I could have worded that a bit differently. There's the broader community amenity contributions policy, and then separate from that, we're going to be getting the affordable housing policy implementation plan coming back to council. And like, do you have a sense of what the timing would be on that? So for example, are we going to get the land economist report in November with this policy updated, attached to it? Or is it more, we're getting another presentation from Mr. Parker, and then at some point after that, we're getting a revised version of the housing policy? I'm really trying to get a sense of timing, and if I could maybe explain it a bit more. I think the challenge for me is 9 years at this table, every year we're talking about the housing policy, and every year it's, and this isn't a criticism of staff or previous councils, other priorities emerge, but every year we talk about the housing policy, and there's always something we're waiting for, whether it's the old Coriolis report from 2015 or working on the new OCP. And this particular policy here, we gave the direction to move forward with it. I believe it was in January of 2021, and we're coming up on 4 years since, haven't implemented it yet. And again, that's not a criticism of staff at all. I was the one who suggested we delay it, and we did have an OCP, Bell-McKinnon Local Area Plan, and many other projects that came up in recent years. There's very good reasons for the delay, but yeah, getting back to my question, Mr. Osborne, is with Mr. Parker coming back at some point in November, what's your sense of when that housing policy would be in front of council for adoption again?
It's a slightly difficult question to answer. I mean, there is a draft policy in front of council, which in theory council could adopt at any time. But obviously once we have Mr. Parker's report, there may be information in that may prompt us to recommend changes to the policy. So it could potentially put us in a situation of adopting policy and then wishing to revise it quite shortly thereafter. That's the risk.
A couple options will probably present themselves to staff, Mr. Mayor, depending on what council does on this motion. If you do delay it and staff receives the information from Mr. Parker and we're confident that it works into the existing policy, then we'll likely be back to talk to you immediately following his presentation or even as part of it. If there's a huge disconnect between what Mr. Parker finds and what the reality of the implications of the current housing policy have, then we'll want to talk to council about, is this meeting your needs or do you want to amend it? So I suspect sometime in December is when you'll likely have if you delay it and you move forward based on Mr. Parker's, that you'll be reviewing something that is based on Mr. Parker's information.
Great, thank you. I've got Councillor Finley, Councillor Stash, then Councillor Justice.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I just want to say again that I'm 100% against this type of policy in our market. I think affordable housing is not in our lane, as Councillor Manhas said, and as Mr. Gerbis said in an email to us. Mr. Gerbis and I don't see eye to eye on some things, but we definitely see eye to eye in this. It's not in our sandbox to play in with taxpayers' money. Only the market will determine the price of housing. And the thing that really struck me today is I looked up the MERB program that was put in place in the late 70s and early 80s in BC, in Canada. It was a federal program. And the majority of apartments that we see in our community were built during that time because the federal government put an incredibly good program in place to build multifamily, especially fast. That's why it's MERB, multi-unit residential building program. And it was a brilliant program that took all the risk off the municipalities and the provinces and put all the risk on the developers and the feds. And what happened was it provided incentives and tax breaks and ability to write off significant costs against the building program. That's the sort of program that we need in this country to solve our housing crisis. We can't do it here. And I think Mr. Parker talked about that. We can't do it here. The province can't do it. It's got to come from the feds. And so a policy that is likely going to hinder development that we're trying to put forward here at this table, I'm 100% against. And I think it was also Mr. Gerbis or someone else put in their email about Montreal putting a similar policy in place, and not one affordable unit was provided. They're all paid into a fund, and that fund sits there and nothing gets built. And so I am definitely not going to be voting in favor of this or any other policy regarding affordable housing.
Councillor Stash, then Councillor Justice.
Thank you, Worship. My original question was actually answered and was to support Councillor Finney's concern on just intake from developers. But Mr. Osborne's feedback on the report with the study group would have direct relationships. So that's an added bonus then on the deferral of to have this the economic report attached into the affordable housing policy, is that we're going to get that direct feedback that Councillor Finley's concerned with. So we're going to have a direct peer group giving feedback. So that can, in my waiting, that was answered, was what my original question was going to be. But as a follow-up, is a failing to act is just preparing for failure if we don't do something in regards to the housing, whereas I think we have an onus right now. The clear messaging from the province and federal governments is they are ready and willing to build that housing, but what has shifted in the last 40 years is they want the municipalities to do that, and they're going to put up all the funds, as we've seen with the Housing Accelerator Fund that just came forward, that we just applied for significant grants, almost to, was that 9 figures worth of grants in with the federal government. And the great work we're doing with BC Housing and other projects where they're at the table ready and committed and trying to make things happen. And they just were, as a affordable housing fund, in our case, that we're trying to outlay here, allows us to what municipalities do is control land within their areas. And this is going to give us the tools to be a partner with the province and feds together. So while, yes, absolutely, we're not with a housing crisis, we have a duty of care to those at most at risk in our community, and that's what affordable housing policy is about. As to the comment earlier on that there aren't descriptions, the affordable housing document here clearly outlines who's at risk and what people are at risk and what those targets are. What is affordable? It's $1,134 for a 1-bedroom room in North Cowichan. The average rate in North Cowichan right now is $1,600 a month. So clearly here we're trying to find ways to help people fit that to get to that $1,100 a month for a rental in North Cowichan. So I'll be supporting every version of the affordable housing policy that comes together as long as we can get consensus on council, and I think we will get there. So long-winded little spiel there, and then thank you to Mr. Osborne for answering my question on will we be able to get some good input from developers as to when we do surveys. There's never a perfect time. There's always a reason that this survey isn't good or that survey isn't great. There never will be a perfect time, but the fact is that we did it and we did have engagement. Is it the engagement we wanted? Do we have enough? Those are always going to be debated, but we had engagement and we made the opportunity there for the public, and that's part of being, as our OCP calls for, transparency. That's the best we can do. And I thank everybody that did take the time to commit and come in and speak and write letters. Doesn't matter what end of the spectrum that those comments are on or side of the table, is that it's being done. So on every email we get on this and other topics tonight, again, thank the public for doing that and taking the time to do it. Because we may not respond, but we do see your emails, so please keep emails coming as well.
Thanks, Councillor Stash, Councillor Justice, then Councillor Calia.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. So, there's both advantages and disadvantages to waiting. I think the danger in waiting is that developments may present themselves, and we will not have the opportunity, or we'll miss an opportunity to negotiate some sort of affordable housing contribution. But as we saw for Robert Street, right, there's still, even without a policy actually adopted, there's the possibility that staff can continue to negotiate affordable housing contributions while we wait. So I'm wondering whether we should not amend this motion to ensure that staff does continue to negotiate affordable housing contributions in the meantime while we wait, or whether staff can simply assure us that that will occur.
Yeah, my understanding is that staff would continue to negotiate these contributions on more of an ad hoc basis, but I will turn to
Mr. Mayor, absolutely, we would continue. The OCP is pretty clear on trying to achieve these goals, and that's, we would bring forward an application. Ultimately, it's council's the adjudicator of that, and if you aren't happy with what we've negotiated, as you've seen, you would send it back.
Mr. Swaby, just with Councillor Justice's question with regards to whether we amend the motion or if there's an understanding between council and staff, do you have any advice for us on that? Would a motion provide clear guidance, or are the policy pretty clear? So,
I was trying to indicate that I think it's pretty clear.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, one more thing, Mr. Mayor. One thing I think would be an advantage in waiting is that it might give us time to look at which CAC objectives we want to support and in what proportion. I think one of the things that's happened is we've been sort of so concerned with affordable housing, we may have sort of forgotten about the balance with other objectives, and CACs are obviously a very limited resource, and perhaps even more limited than we want them to be. As we just heard from Mr. Parker, and but they do need to be applied to a number of objectives, and in the affordable housing policy, we are presupposing an amount, at least in the draft form. I guess we're rethinking it, but you know, we're really thinking about affordable housing with outside of the context of other community amenity objectives, and in what proportion we might want to dedicate CACs to those various objectives. So I wonder, you know, in the meantime, whether there are any opportunities to have that discussion. And I would throw that to staff. I mean, is that something that we can do while we're waiting?
I would suggest that every property, my experience tells me that every property has unique challenges, that staff look at the package of issues that we need to talk to the developer about. Community amenities is one part of it, off-site servicing is a part of it. The neighborhood plan has a whole bunch of issues that it calls for. So it always is a bundle of issues that we have to balance and bring forward to council. I think to have a discussion between now and when Parker gets back probably is not worth the time that it's going to take, given he's coming back sometime in November, given that we already have a pretty complex set of asks that we already sit down and negotiate with the developer, and then council adjudicates as it gets to you.
Right, if I may, Mr. Swaby, I mean, I think that that's true, but that's the way that we've always done it outside of the context of a community amenity contribution policy, right? So, like, as we're codifying this process, and we're finding out that it's difficult to, you know, codify it once and for all, but as we're codifying it, don't we also need to think about the various objectives and what proportion we're interested in a general sense?
It might help to have an example that you can provide that would demonstrate what you're talking about, because I think I was trying to indicate there's so many different things that we're faced with negotiating outside of the policy. If you're only talking within the specific policy that you're developing, there's many other things that we're looking at as they come forward, so. If you're looking to prioritize what's in the policy, I still wonder what value that'll have, given the time frame to have Mr. Parker come back.
Okay, I'll leave it at that and think about it some more.
I'd love to talk more about it offline if you'd like, just to understand it better.
Councillor Calia.
Thank you, Mayor. I know this is strange, but I agree with Councillor Manhas and Councillor Finley. To me, I'm for affordable housing, and we need more affordable housing in this community. And I'm not 100% sure how we're going to accomplish that. And this, when I look at what's in here, there's a lot of ways that are great to move forward with from the municipality. But I also, look at some of it and I go, well, buying up old hotels and motels and converting them into housing, I mean, I think that's just fraught with danger. I, myself personally, don't believe that the residents of North Cowichan want to become landlords and looking after buildings and the residents in there. I think that the affordable housing policy, lots of it are good, but to me, the buying up of buildings and using them ourselves, I think this is something that, we don't have deep pockets here in North Cowichan, and even though we're going to take some of the CACs and put them into a fund to help affordable housing, I don't think that that's probably going to be enough of a fund to maintain these. We'll either have to get grants from the provincial and federal governments, which like Councillor Finley said, I don't think this is in our lane. I think we need to stick to what is a municipality is supposed to be doing, and that's looking after what the residents' needs are. And yes, I have empathy for the people out there who can't get a house right now. Like even my son's at home, they can't afford to buy a home right now. It's tough for everybody. But I just think that the municipality itself is, doesn't want to end up being a landlord. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Calia. Councillor Ross.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I know it's the question. I've looked at all these answers for the surveys. There's multiple, answers here, and one of them was, what is true affordable housing? When we're looking at that, and you look at the reports on TV and the news and whatnot, and they look at giving out numbers, they throw out numbers of how much the rent is over in the mainland now for 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom. It's horrifying. And again, Mr. Gerbis had mentioned, what is true affordability? And 30% of someone's income is what I'd like to see. And I think part of this affordable housing policy that we're trying to create here, and again, it's just a draft again of going forward, and it's a guideline of what we're looking for. And the province is asking all municipalities to start building. But I think we need to push back again too, but also having the CICs and having those contributions for affordable housing, it is not going to build anything, because like we've looked at other places on TV where they're reporting out saying they've been getting this funding and putting it aside, but they haven't built anything yet. It's because it's so expensive. So everyone's struggling, and what is this going to look like? And I know we're trying to save our taxpayers in all of this as well, because it's all connected. The disorderly on the streets and the unhoused. One thing that our CAO had mentioned, building these wraparound housing units. We'll be building one, but we need multiple resources for this, right? And I think that's the other thing too. It's an overwhelming task, But I think this is just a baseline of something that we could work with, and then push the federal and provincial government to help with those added costs of funding something. We can, you know, someone had mentioned donate some land and then get the province or federal government to pay and be responsible for those units. Yes, I know we should not become landlords. But again, if we don't have a guideline of what we can set the 30% or 50% or of someone's income, I think that's something, you know, would get out of hand. Someone had mentioned, you know, you'd have that developer build something, but yet they'll be going up in percentage in rent every year. And I think it was Vancouver's 3.5%, I think it was reported yesterday. And they said, oh, well, that's better than 5%. But that's still, the rent is still going up and up. So I don't know, it's just sort of having that control of the fluctuation of how much that affordability would be for families and housing. And we're trying to attract people, young families, to stay here. So I don't know, it's just something that it's not perfect, but I think it's something that we can work with. Thanks.
Mr. Mayor, I just wanted to remind council too that there's such a variety of ways that the housing affordability policy is looking as a tool to be implemented. Extracting out of developers community contributions or amenities that relate to this is just one part of it. We're already a landlord de facto. We provide land for $1 for 20, 30, 60 years, and societies are managing housing projects. So we've donated the land, and we continue to look that way to be a partner with the province in those situations. We provide a whole bunch of money through the CVRD to a housing fund in which the society looks to develop housing projects in our community. So we're already doing many of these things because it's the only way to target that kind of affordability. The affordability that Councillor Toporowski just mentioned about the 30% of income is really what we target primarily with the developers to include in part of their development, so that we can get that part of the mixed use out of the development industry, the private development industry. So I just wanted to remind us there's so many different ways that we're trying to approach this that's important to have a multi-pronged approach to solve this or be part of solving the problem.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Swaby. That's really helpful. I think it's a lot of our discussion has focused on what we can extract from developments, but as you said, there's a wide range of tools and approaches that we can take. Well, we've all spoken on the motion on the floor. Some of us several times. We ready to call the question? So it's again referring it back to staff in anticipation of Mr. Parker coming back with his land economics analysis, and that subsequent to that presentation, we'll have an opportunity to consider either it could be the same policy or it could have revisions depending on what we hear back from Mr. Parker. Yeah, Councillor Justice.
Mr. Mayor, because this recommendation is that the council and the whole direct staff to wait, what would a vote in opposition of this do?
Is that a question for Mr. Swaby, Ms. May?
I believe, and I'll look to Ms. May, I think it means that when it gets to council, you'd be directing us to de facto implement the policy as it is, and then when the report comes back from Mr. Parker, you could consider whether you amend it, I think.
Thank you. I just wanted the people who were likely to vote against this to know what they were voting for.
All right, so on the motion on the floor, all in favor? And opposed? Councillor Manas opposed, the motion carries. All right, we'll now move on to item 6.3, zoning bylaw rewrite process.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The purpose of this is to introduce the proposed the program and schedule for comprehensively updating the zoning bylaw number 2950, and the recommendation from staff is that the committee of the whole recommend to council that they endorse in broad terms the proposed program sequencing and timing of the zoning amendment modules for staff to bring forward for consideration as set out in attachment 1 to the planning manager's September 12th, 2023 report.
Great, thanks, Mr. Swaby. And as I'm sure council picked up from reading the report, basically what is, as Mr. Swaby mentioned, it's taking the module approach rather than one big bylaw, which is going to take us potentially years to adopt, doing it in different phases, which would yeah, hopefully allow us to make the necessary changes in a more timely manner and deliver some results for our community. So we have a recommendation moved by Councillor Stash, seconded by Councillor Justice. To speak on the motion, Councillor Stash.
Just wanted to thank staff for coming up with an approach in a systematic way rather than the all-in-one, because usually when projects are so large, it's a bit of, runs into a bit of analysis paralysis trying to get everything done all at once. So I really like seeing this, and it's also mindful of staff limitations by the amount of workload that we have in front of us on so many different topics, and this can have small wins on an incremental basis. So I was very pleased to see this come forward.
Great, thanks, Councillor Stash. Councillor Justice, then Councillor Finlay.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I do think that the modular approach makes sense given the size of the task, like Councillor Stash. And I believe it also makes sense to deal first with the legacy zoning, where the zoning allows things that are clearly at odds with the OCP designations. But I do have a couple of questions, perhaps for Mr. Osborne. And I guess the first is about the timing of the second module, especially the part of it that pertains to agriculture, and I guess especially how that might align with the timing of the formation of an agricultural advisory committee. And I wonder if staff see the perceived need to, or a timing conflict with the need to consult with an agricultural advisory committee on details of the zoning.
Through to Councillor Justice, achieving this module certainly wouldn't be contingent upon having input from an advisory agricultural committee, so it could progress in advance of that. That said, it could also be adjusted in light of whatever recommendations a future committee might make.
Okay, thanks. I was also curious about the timing of the development permit guidelines, and I guess I would have thought that they were critical components of a number of other council master plans or plans, such as the Climate Action and Energy Plan, the Biodiversity Protection Plan, and probably several others that I haven't thought of. But can you explain why the development permit guidelines come at such a late stage of the process?
Through to Councillor Justice, all the components here are ultimately important because it culminates in the replacement of the zoning bylaw as a whole. The DP guidelines are certainly a way of achieving many of the policy objectives in the OCP. They tend to be the more design-based objectives rather than the fundamental issues of land use and density. So those more fundamental issues are kind of front-loaded in this process. The other part of putting the DP review further down the list is it does require a considerable amount of external review, so by subject matter experts, so for example, geotechnical expert for the hazard slope guidelines, urban design specialists for form and character design guidelines, and so on. So that background work from external contractors can take place in the background while we move forward with these other modules, such that we'll be in a position, hopefully, by the time we reach that item, to put a fully polished product in front of council.
Thank you.
Councillor Finlay.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. What happens if we get a subdivision or rezoning application on one of these sections while this process is going on, or do we go off the current zoning policies, or how does that exactly work?
Mr. Swaby.
So That's an interesting question, and we would certainly seek some legal advice, but my experience with this is that because the zoning bylaw is a bylaw, that they would have 1 year exemption for subdivisions from the time that the bylaw is adopted to complete the subdivision. But we would certainly want to seek some legal advice on that.
All right, yeah, Councillor Manas.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just want a clarification, Mr. Swaby, on that. So it's 1 year to complete the project, or 1 year from date of when you submit your application?
I recall that the Land Title Act or the Local Government Act speaks to that they're exempt from bylaws adopted when you're subdividing if you're in stream for a 1 year period from the date it's adopted. But I'll have to check on that and make sure we have the legal understanding of that. That's my recollection of it.
The reason, because we ran into that problem right now at the Robert Street. They've been in the books with the all the OCP for the last 2-3 years, and and they got screwed.
Different situation when it's an OCP amendment.
All right, we've got a motion on the floor. It's moved and seconded. All in favor and opposed? Motion carries. We'll now move on to the item 6.4, 2024 permissive tax exemption applications. And I would ask council, there is an application on here from the Clement Centre Society. So Councillor Manas and I previously declared conflicts of interest on this, so we're not going to be able to vote on those specific applications. So I would ask that if anyone wants to bring forward a motion, I know we have a staff recommendation. Councillor Justice, you have an alternative recommendation as well, but I would ask that we specify in that motion that we will be excluding the Clement Centre Society, so that after we've dealt with that, Councillor Manas and I can step out of the room. Councillor Toporowski can assume the chair's role and deal with the Clement Centre separately from the other 71 applications. Or 74, right? 4 from Clement Centre Society, I think. So I've seen a bunch of hands go up. I think it's Councillor Justice, you first, then Councillor Toporowski, then Councillor Stash.
Mr. Mayor, I will wait for any informational questions or whatever they want to do. I just wanted the opportunity to speak to a motion that I'd like to see made before we consider the main
the recommendation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Councillor Toporowski.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm just looking for a procedure because I'd like to pull 1 and also 3 from this so we can talk about it separately. Or no, number 1 would be, yes, number 1, because there's Camp Kiwanis is on that list of approving the prior years. So I just wanted to discuss that one as well.
I'll turn to the corporate officer and ask for some advice on how we can manage that. If we do want to pull one of the properties from number 1, and I mean there's others as well that Councillor Manas and I have to declare conflicts on, would that be?
Right, so why don't we decide up front which ones we want to pull ahead of time and have that list of which we pull, and then consider mind you, we have a motion perhaps coming from Councillor Justice first, so, you know, we're getting ahead of ourselves, or?
Yeah, perhaps we'll, any questions council has for staff or any information you may want, we'll finish with that first, and then we'll get into the details of which motion we want to bring
But
forward.
I think that would be the best approach, would be to look at it, pull the ones you want to consider separately, vote on the remainder, and then deal with them one at a time.
All right. Okay. Councillor Stash.
Councillor Toporowski asked my question. I was going to say that we had severed an additional one just for efficiency in the motions at hand, so thank you.
All right. Any, Councillor Finlay.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I'm struggling with the idea of removing certain properties or certain groups for discussion, because there's quite a few groups and properties on here that I think we should discuss further. If we're thinking about, you know, certain places that can afford more because they have better income, there's substantial income, substantial assets from several of these groups. I looked through every single balance sheet and every single income statement in our 889 pages, And there are some groups that can afford to pay absolutely every single penny of these taxes that they're potentially being exempted for. And there are some groups that absolutely cannot afford any, and we should 100% be on board for. The other issue I have is that if we're looking at certain groups because of their mission statements or that they happen to be faith-based, there's a substantial list of groups and properties on this list that could fall into that discussion as well. So I think it's dangerous to start looking at individual groups and policies this year, for sure, because there's several that I would absolutely support and there's several that I'm 100% against. So I don't know where that leaves us, but you know, when certain groups have $1 billion of assets and they're looking for a tax exemption from us, I have a problem with that. I have a significant problem with that. And you know, other groups with $400 million worth of assets and $244 million worth of cash sitting on their balance sheet, and they're looking for an exemption of $10,000 from us. I have a problem with that. You know, again, Mr. Gerbis and I agree on some of this portion that there's thousands, tens of thousands of dollars that we're exempting for groups that can afford it. And then we're talking about some groups that cannot afford it that we might exempt or not exempt because of their mission statements. So I don't know where I stand on the rest of this, but I just wanted to put that forward.
Great. Thank you, Councillor Finlay. Councillor Calia?
I just wanted to ask a question. Each one of these, we're going to vote on each one of these individually. So,
No, what we could do, and I'll just maybe throw this out there, although we've got Councillor Justice's motion as well, so things could get a bit convoluted, but we could potentially vote on number one. Which,
no, I'm not saying like all the Clement Center ones.
Oh, you mean each of the 4
as an
points.
individual block, right?
Yeah,
each organization by itself. I'm not saying we're going to vote on Clement Center, Clement Center, Clement Center, Clement Center.
Yeah, or we could take the staff recommendation with the 4 points and then just add additional points for the exception. So if one councillor's asked for, like, I've suggested Clements for myself, Councillor Manhas, Councillor Toporowski suggested Camp Quanos, we could separate those as 0.5 and 0.6. Okay. And if Councillor Finlay, if there's any you want to suggest, that can add additional points here to separate specific applications from the collective applications that were submitted. So, Councillor Justice, do you want to speak to your motion you circulated
please. I mean,
today?
I think the questions that are coming up, and especially Councillor Finley's concerns, are exactly the basis of what I was feeling and trying to achieve with this. I mean, I found this task to be really overwhelming and difficult to do in any sort of systematic and way that I consider to be fair, because everything's on a sliding scale, and there's one thing that can afford it, and then but what about the one that has half as much money, that sort of thing. I guess the basis of our policy is simply that the organizations must fulfill some basic needs or otherwise improve the quality of life of North Cowichan residents, which I find is just a little bit too ambiguous. And I think to make good decisions, we really need to have some substantial analysis and recommendations based on a council debated and a policy that has some sorts of criteria for decision making in it. So what I'd like to do is propose, before we get into this, that we continue this process but just give any tax exemptions that we decide are worthy for a year, and by the next year develop a beefed up policy which allows a more thorough and systematic analysis. So I have prepared and circulated a motion to that effect, and Mr. Mayor, if you think that that's reasonable, I'll read it out and hope that somebody
yeah, please do.
It. Okay, so the motion is that the Committee of the Whole directs staff to, 1, establish the term for exemptions in the new permissive tax exemption bylaw to be for 1 year, and 2, coordinate a workshop for council to consider amendments to the permissive tax exemptions bylaw that align with best practices in other jurisdictions and which include A, evaluation scoring criteria related to, but not limited to, alignment with municipal policies and values such as inclusion and equity, availability of services and activities to all or a good proportion of municipal residents, availability of services without restrictive or expensive membership, service provision by volunteers, and I would add the one that Councillor Finley raised, which is, you know, absolute ability to pay, which I didn't think of. And B, establish the maximum percentage for exemptions based on organizations meeting the criteria set out in the policy, which, as I read that, is a little bit convoluted, but I'll explain what it means if I get a seconder and I'm allowed to keep babbling.
Is there a seconder? Second by Councillor Toporowski. Continue.
Thank you. So, as was pointed out by Mr. Gerbis, oft quoted tonight, I mean, this is about a lot of money, right? $627,000 this year in foregone taxes, and that's money that really has to be made up by other taxpayers, so it's whatever, being subsidized. So I, you know, really think it's necessary to do this systematically and fairly, and I'm struggling with knowing how much more to say about it, but I did want to make a couple of points. I found myself wondering, for example, why we would be providing a private yacht club with a permissive tax exemption. You know, shouldn't a criteria be that the services provided are available to all residents without an expensive membership? I would note that Victoria's policy limits permissive tax exemption to organizations that use volunteers to deliver services. And then there's the issue of a camp that apparently is an unfriendly environment to a substantial and equity-seeking portion of our community. And so all of these sorts of considerations, which are important and hard to balance one against the other, it seems to me we really need to think through and develop some sort of a beefed up policy with evaluation criteria that we can use to make better and more systematic decisions in the future. Of course, we can't do that for this year, but we could in a year from now.
All right, thank you, Councillor Justice. The motion's been moved and seconded. Any other comments? Councillor Finley? And then
Thanks,
Councillor
Mr. Mayor. I am curious what sort of implications this could be for staff to you know, coordinate this workshop and do research. You know, like Councillor Justice has suggested here. I'm not opposed to the idea, but is this going to add significant staff hours and time and costs for implementing something like this?
Mr. Swaby?
I'm not entirely sure. It's definitely work. It sounds like we haven't done a review of this in years, and it sounds like it is important for council to provide some clearer direction to staff. I've seen many different models. There's no perfect model, and it always comes down to a very political decision at the end of the day. But I think a workshop would be valuable to sort of source out some of the issues that council might be struggling with, and depending on where we go from there would depend on how complicated the process might be. I've seen whole committees of council set up to evaluate this because ultimately council has to adjudicate the values that it has implemented, and some of them are very challenging, as you saw tonight, on where they might lie. But I think it's probably a good idea to actually have a workshop and talk this through a little bit and see where the issues lie, and I can give you better understanding of the amount of time after we do that.
Great, thanks, Mr. Swaby. A follow-up, Councillor Finley.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. So I just want to be clear from Councillor Justice, this recommendation is to approve this year's and then do the workshop through the next year, then look at it a little further. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, that's fair. of course, I'm not saying approve all of them this year. I'm saying let's just go through the process, but only for 1 year, and then develop a more stringent set of criteria.
Another follow-up?
Yeah, follow-up. And I think it comes down to, you know, we've had a couple of emails and a couple of speakers talk about two specific groups that are looking for exemptions. We did not invite those groups to speak here tonight, and I think that might be unfair if we're looking at these groups and for these exemptions that we've given them in the past. They've been thrown under the bus by certain people for what they're believed to be their positions, but we haven't been able to ask those groups what their positions actually are. So I think it might be incredibly unfair to not provide those exemptions to those groups when they're not here to discuss their positions and what they do for the community, regardless of what several people have said that they do.
Thanks, Councillor Fenley. I'll go to Councillor Manhas, then Councillor Toporowski.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Mayor. My concern is a lot of these organizations, I know the Vancouver Island Sea Cultural Society, after 10 years, every 10 years have to fill this out, and they were having issues or finding people to fill out the application form. I just think in 1 year, I think that maybe keep this for 2 years or 3 years, because most of these organizations run by volunteers. Church groups are dwindling. You know, their revenues are dropping. I just don't think that they have the capacity to go through this whole process again next year. So that is my concern.
Thanks, Councillor Manhas. Councillor Toporowski, then Councillor Stash.
Thank you, Mayor. Almost forgot what I was going to say. Just talking about this is just a snapshot of what a budget line by line would be. As Councillor Finley had mentioned, he would like to go through the budget line by line. So this is part of something that we make decisions on and what we fund or don't fund or whatnot. The other thing about the emails we've been receiving, and also I'm going to just talk about House of Grace, but I don't think this is the motion to talk about it. But the two, House of Grace and Camp Kiwanis, I won't go into full detail on that right now because it's not this motion. School district had mentioned about the Camp Kiwanis, and other constituents were voicing their concerns about how they feel about it. Taxpayers, other taxpayers that have contacted us in regards to this as well. So that was one of the reasons why I wanted to pull this from the list, because school district of Nanaimo and Duncan and all of these other places have said they're pulling their support. So I just wanted to get a feel around this table. What does that look like for us at North Cowichan? Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Stash.
Your Worship, my quick question was the follow-up on what Councillor Manhas said and the way it is we're worded in Councillor Justice's motion on line 1. And I don't know if it's actually a financial legal requirement that we have to review every year, or is that could be that in there it says, do we look at, is it an annual review on certain things? So in that motion, that would be part of what the workshop would flush out. So I don't know if that needs to be captured in the workshop, only being that, is that a legal possibility to, approve for 2-year windows? So I just wanted to see that maybe at least if this is motion, when we do vote on it, it passes, maybe that's just something that doesn't need to be worded in, but it's one of those things we've done before where staff get the gist of it.
So that in the workshop, we'll discuss different options, whether it's like
1
2 or
year,
3
every
years
year, it's
instead
2 year,
of
3 year. I really like what Councillor Manhas thought.
Mr. Mayor, what we heard was review best practices, and I think that would include what you're referring to.
I knew the CAO would have a right term as the understanding is best practices.
All right, so we've got a motion on the floor. It's been seconded. Any further discussion? I'll call the question. All in favor? And oppose? Councillor Manhas opposed. The motion carries. So we can now deal with the staff recommendation with the understanding, and I will turn to the corporate officer, we are gonna be removing, Camp Kiwanis and the Clement Center Society as separate points. And Councillor Finley, are there any other applications you want separated?
Well, I think we should discuss these other ones today. The SPCA, Red Cross. This is, I'm sure, going to be a bit contrarian, but Ducks Unlimited, Island Corridor Foundation, Nature Conservancy, and the Nature Trust of BC.
So those 6 plus the other 2, then we'll have 8 applications to vote on separately, or to sort of.
Those have to be put forward as a motion first, so if we don't agree that those all have to be pulled, that's not the way it works, correct, as a point of order?
I'll turn to the corporate officer, but I believe any member of council can sever, I guess we can sever multiple points in a motion, but can we sever the applications?
So there isn't really a motion on the floor right now. So I would suggest that you do put that in a motion, that the following applications be pulled for consideration separately. Right now, but there's nothing for consideration right now in front of council.
Sure. Well, if we pull that one, just 1 sec, Councillor Kelly, if we pull those 6, then I'm thinking we should also have a motion whether or not we're going to pull Camp Kiwanis. And then, but I'm assuming we don't have to have a motion for Clement Center because we've already declared the conflict, we can't.
Yeah, you're in conflict with that one.
Okay, how about then, if this makes sense to you all, I'll start off with the 6 that Councillor Finley's pulled, and then we'll discuss whether we want a motion to pull Camp Kiwanis application as well. Does that work?
That's up to you, Mr. Mayor, if that's how you want to go, if that's how you want to move forward with it.
But before I turn to that, I'll just go to Councillor Callio and then Councillor Finley.
Thank you, Mayor. I'd just like to say that I'd like to make a motion to put all 6 and the other 2, Camp Kiwanis and House of Grace, all together in one motion and bring them so that we can discuss them separately from the rest of the tax exemption, permissive tax exemptions.
All right, I think we can leave House of Grace because it's already 0.3, but it would be the Councillor Kelly, could we treat them separately? Because I think there's some different views on those 6 versus the Camp Kiwanis application.
So that you have to separate for the 2 and then.
Just vote on them separately. The sense I'm getting is there may be some different views on those, that one application versus the group of 6.
Sure, I'll change my motion to the 6.
To the 6. We'll start with the 6 then. So it's whether or not to remove the SPCA, Red Cross, Ducks Unlimited, Island Corridor Foundation, Nature Conservancy in Canada, Nature Trust of BC, and deal with these separately, individually from the group. Councillor Finley? All right, okay. Moved, seconded. So all in favor of treating these, discussing these as a block separate from the collective applications? All in favor? And opposed? Councillors Justice, Douglas, and Istache opposed. Motion carries. We will treat those 6 separately. And then with, there was a suggestion to treat the Camp Kiwanis application separately as well. So I know that was your suggestion, Councillor Toporowski. Could I ask you to move that we treat Camp Kiwanis separately? Yeah, so it's moved, seconded. All in favor? And opposed? Councillor Finley opposed. Motion carries. All right. So so now we've got essentially, and I will turn to the corporate officer again. With that block of 6, should we be treating those voting on, assuming individually? Makes the most sense rather than a block, because there's going to be different, I'm sure, arguments for each one of them.
So the recommendation is that, you've got the 4 parts of the original recommendation from staff. I'm just wondering how that's gonna work now with the, so for 100%.
Oh, sorry, carry on.
So 100% tax exemption for all land and improvements to all organizations that council had granted in prior years. with the exception of the 6, or,
The 8, right?
no, with the
Yeah.
6 versions of Clement Center and Camp Quanos.
Or no, but remember we want SPCA, Red Cross, Ducks Unlimited.
Right.
So could we say with the exception of the 8 applications? Because even if it's multiple properties, have they not submitted one application per?
I'm not sure. One application.
Or did
for-
Clement submit several? Or could we say the applications from the 8 organizations? Yeah.
That sounds the best to me.
All right, so we've got the staff recommendation. Does someone want to move that we amend it based on that wording, that it's going to exclude those 8?
Mr. Mayor, I've lost track. What's happened to the House of Grace? Is that?
So House of Grace is its own standalone
Okay, thank you.
point here, number 3. We're only dealing with number 1, but we just want to remove those 8 organizations from consideration for number 1. So Camp Quanos, SPCA, Red Cross, Ducks Unlimited, Island Quarter Foundation, Nature Conservancy of Canada, Nature Trust BC, and Clement Center Society. So we clear? All right. So does someone want to move the first recommendation as amended? Moved by Councillor Estache, seconded by Councillor Justice. Councillor Finlay?
Just so I'm clear, we're doing option 1 of the recommended staff recommendation. Number 1, that's excluded all the others, the ones we've excluded.
Yeah, minus the
Okay.
8, yeah. All right, any further discussion? You ready to call the question? All in favor? And opposed? Motion carries. Number 2, so the recommendation is a 50% of all land improvements for Class A for Maple Bay Yacht Club and the Mount Breton Golf Course. Do we have a mover? Moved by Councillor Calio. Seconded by Councillor Estache. Any discussion, Councillor Estache?
What are the, I do like what Councillor Justice brought up for a private organization. You know, what are the precedents for a private organization of that? It's for its exemption, and then as well, what does the CVRD do for the golf courses in the region? Are those golf courses exempt as well? I'm just curious. I'm just looking for information on those.
Yeah, I don't have the answer to that question, but I will turn to staff.
Our Director of Finance can help.
So through your worship, Class 8 is considered not-for-profit, so they are not-for-profit as per legislation. They meet the criteria. They are for-profit, but they're not for-profit. Golf, I know that makes no sense. So there are quite a few municipalities that give golf courses. Like I just came from the city of Dawson Creek, and they give the golf course a tax exemption. They are not-for-profit, so they meet the criteria.
And do we have any experience on private yacht clubs? Anywhere else on the island, Councillor? If I could, is it okay to ask Councillor Justice? You said Victoria had a policy or something?
Victoria's policy does not speak to private yacht clubs, as far as I know.
Hopefully your motion then will help us for next year. Thank you.
Any further discussion? So we've got a motion on the floor, moved and seconded, 50% reduction for Maple Bay Yacht Club and Mount Breton Golf Course. Councillor Justice.
There are 2 golf courses in North Cowichan, right? Do we know if the other one, that's I guess the one along Highway 18, is this something that they just haven't bothered to apply for, or have they been turned down in the past, or is there any difference between that golf course and the one in Chemainus?
Yeah,
Not that I know of.
Yeah, Councillor Manas, if you have something
the
you
one,
can say on
Duncan
that.
Meadows is actually a private, it's privately owned. And I do believe the Mount Breton one is not privately owned, it's owned by the members. I think that's the difference. Owned by society, yes.
Right, thank you.
Councillor Callier, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I just wanted to say that exactly what Councillor Mannas said, is it's privately owned, and it's the difference between that and Mount Breton is it's a society that owns the Mount Breton Golf Course.
Councillor Finlay.
Could we sever these two? Is that possible? And, or because I struggle with both of these, but you know, having a non-profit golf course owned by members, well, it's the same thing, I guess. It's a non-profit yacht club owned by members. Disregard, thank you.
Any further comments from council? Okay, the motion's on the floor. It's moved and seconded. All in favor? And opposed? Motion carries. We'll now move on to number 3. It's an incomplete recommendation because council will have to determine what the percentage would be, but it's for a tax exemption for land and improvements leased to the House of Grace Pregnancy Center. Oh yeah, Councillor Finlay.
I'd like to make the motion to insert 100%.
It's been moved by Councillor Finlay for 100% tax exemption for the House of Grace Pregnancy Center. Do we have a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Callio.
We're voting on an amendment to the motion, or no? Because the motion was never made.
No, because the motion's not complete. We're expected to insert the percentage here.
What does a vote in opposition do?
And a vote in opposition?
What does it do? Does it kill the whole thing, or do we just have to reduce the number to 99?
Yeah, it just kills the 100%.
Yeah, we could
You
vote
could
on
then,
it
you could
100
then
times
pass
if
a
we want.
motion to give to 50%.
Yeah, Councillor Finlay.
So the reason I'm suggesting 100% is we're talking $1,507, I think it is. I mean, it's in comparison to some of these other exemptions, it's pennies. And it is a small operation that, while some people don't believe it's doing good, it is obviously there. It's obviously meeting a need, otherwise it would not be there. And so one of the requirements of our exemption is that it meets the needs of our residents. And it doesn't say all of our residents, it says our residents. And like Councillor Justice says, it might be vague, but that's what it says. And so I think that's something we should consider seriously.
Any other comments from council? I'll call the question. All those in favor? And opposed? Councillors Douglas, Estache, Toporowski, and Justice opposed. The motion's defeated.
Mr. Mayor, I would move putting 0% tax exemption in place of insert percentage here.
I guess I'm not clear
I'm
on
not
the
sure.
difference. Yeah.
I don't think any motion's required.
Or you could just deny the application.
Yeah. All right. I think we can, yeah, Councillor Toporowski.
Do we need to make a motion to deny it?
Yes, that would be the
I move
best,
the
because they
motion to
have
deny.
applied. Thanks.
Move to deny the application, seconded by Councillor Estache. Any discussion? No discussion. All those in favor? Yeah. And opposed? Councillors Finlay, Callio, and Manhas opposed. The motion carries. All right, we can now move on to point 4 here with regards to tax exemption for all land to Cowichan Community Land Trust, Cowichan Lake property. I believe this is for Rainbow Island. Councillor Justice?
I would move 100% tax exemption.
It's been moved. Do we have a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Estache. Any discussion? Councillor Justice?
Just to point out that this is the little island in Cowichan Lake, Rainbow Island, which is basically just a place for birds to live and do whatever they do on little islands and lakes. It's right, not. That's it.
Councillor Finlay.
How much tax exemption are we talking for this? I don't recall seeing it. $80. Thank you.
Twice the price.
Any further discussion? Are you ready to call the question? All in favor? And opposed? The motion carries. We can now move on to the Camp Kiwanis application. Councillor Toporowski, do you want to start the discussion on this one?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I was just bringing this before council to see what the feel around the table of denying it now, but I do like Councillor Justice's motion to relook at these applications that do come through in regards to this and revisiting them, and also that option of 1 year to 5 years or 10 years again. And I was quite shocked it was 10 years, but I guess what Councillor Manhas had mentioned about small organizations having to refill these applications year after year does make sense of setting those time limits. But getting to why I brought it forward is other organizations have pulled their support for this Camp Kiwanis organization, and I was just looking to see what around the table here, how we feel about pulling our support for this as well.
Any comments from council? I think it's more a question for the rest of council for our thoughts on the application. Does that sound about right, Mr. Toporowski? Okay, Councillor Justice and Councillor Finley.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I won't be able to support a tax exemption for the Camp Kiwanis. I take very seriously the fact that our school board and 2 neighboring school boards have decided to break up with them for reasons that I think are sort of widely known, but essentially related to their attitudes and rules related to LGBTQ persons. And I think given municipal policies related to inclusion, equity, and social justice, this certainly raises some red flags for me, and without more information refuting these issues, I would not be able to support granting this organization a permissive tax exemption at this time.
Councillor Finley.
I think prior to denying a tax exemption that has been in place for years for a group like this, we need to hear from them directly, and whether that's through this process over, as Councillor Justice had recommended, through a workshop that we should hear from this group rather than deny them a tax exemption without allowing them to respond. We're basically saying you're guilty and you can't prove yourself innocent, and that's not how Canadian law works. It's not how we should do things. We should listen to them and understand the position of Councillor Justice regarding the school districts. But at the same time, I still think that Camp Kiwanis should be able to speak directly to us regarding this issue, and so I will be in favor of tax exemption for this group, and definitely a discussion over the next year regarding potential in the future.
Thanks, Councillor Finley. Any Councillor Justice or Eustache?
The other Chris. Only if we used our nicknames here. I do. So 2 parts. Since I'm just curious, I do feel quite strongly on this, being that it has been well vetted, and then the proponent here has had ample opportunity in the public discord to respond, and has chosen to respond in a manner that reaffirms their position. But I do think in this case, if council feels fit, that maybe at the next committee meeting we invite them to speak to their application. But I must say, though, that I do feel the same as Councillor Justice does, and I'd be equally willing to make the motion to deny their request for tax exemption. But I would like to hear them. I don't think this would be the opportunity for them. I think maybe you're saying, Councillor Finley, bold, that people were slinging unwarranted mud at them was a little bold on your part. I think that it has been a little bit warranted, and maybe this is the opportunity for them to say either direction for it. So I guess it would be feeling the bellwether here of what council feels of maybe just deferring this one for them to give them, or is that something we've done? I don't know if there's past precedents here. I don't want to just say, yeah, let's approve it and let's get a new policy in place to address these tough things. I don't think that's the right thing on this one with its particular nature, mostly because it's not a, now, again, it still even gets the other thing. There's been a long-standing discussion on tax exemptions for churches. So this one's, if we deny this, because this is a faith-based choice on this place. But the biggest thing is that it does actually go against the charter in regards to hiring practices. So it isn't about religious beliefs. This one's really about exclusiveness, and then as well the hiring practices that they employ to the public as when they solicit employees. So we want to create, it's in what we all feel, and we've all said we want to create good, safe, inclusive environments. And in this case, I would like to hear from them in a public venue if they're up for it. So I'm leaning towards denying them, but I want to give them the opportunity.
Councillor Calio.
This is a faith-based organization, a church society, and they have the right to hire who they want, and they have their hiring practices. And I believe under the Charter of Rights in Canada, churches have an exemption almost to the Charter of Rights in hiring practices. They are allowed to hire people on the basis of the beliefs that they hold. And they've spoken out by their hiring practices on the beliefs that they hold, and I don't hold to those beliefs myself personally. My sons, both of them, went to Camp Kiwanis, and it's an amazing place. But that being said, I don't think it's right for the municipality of North County to support an organization that can, you know, and I don't think we should contribute to this organization when we don't support their hiring practices. And as a matter of fact, this year we came up with a council policy that spoke to this. And so I won't be supporting for their permissive tax exemption.
Thanks, Councillor Calio. I know Councillor Topper, I was going to speak, but you haven't spoken this yet. Councillor Manhas, so I'll go to you first.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I agree with everything what Councillor Calio said, but I support this tax exemption because what's going to be next? You're going to Sikh temple is not going to be good because their priest is has to be a Sikh. It can be Punjabi or whatever. I just think this is or a Christian that so something else. Another religion, a Muslim religion or something like that. I just think that this is an attack on religion myself. I just did because I'm just so fed up with the attack on religion from everybody around. Not from this table, but just in general.
Councillor Tavares, I think Councillor Kelly just wanted to respond really quick, and then can I come to you?
I'd just like to, I don't want to get into a back and forth, but the thing is this organization and their hiring practices are what they are, and they've spoken out with those, and I am in no way against churches or any kind of faith-based group whatsoever. They have the right to the beliefs, and whatever they believe is up to them, and whatever I believe is up to me. And I have no problem with any church or organization in this community, but I do have a problem with a group that limits and says that certain people cannot be hired depending on their beliefs. It trumps the beliefs of the people who want to be hired by them, and I believe that's not fair, and I won't be supporting this.
Thanks, Councillor Calio. Councillor Toporowski.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to hear from everyone first and have your say, so to speak. I'd like to pass a motion to deny this application, and I just, one of our emails that we received today was looking at the funding that this place does get, and Councillor Finley had mentioned it earlier about, they can afford not to be supported this time again. We have a review that we could look at in a year from now these applications that come forward as well. But again, you know, we've been hearing out in our community about this organization and what happened. And again, yes, everybody does have a choice to go. I know some families that I interact with have sent their children there this year, but it's their choice, right? And I'm not, you know, saying that they should have or shouldn't have. Everybody hears, and that's their choice. We're not shutting them down or anything. We're just denying an application. So I'd like to move the motion to deny their application this year. Thank you.
It's been moved. We have a seconder, seconded by Councillor Stash. Any further comments? So all in favor? And opposed? Councillors Manhas and Finley opposed. The motion carries. Motion carries. I will now move on to the SBCA. Well, I think we've left Clements for the end. Yeah. Leave it to the last item. SBCA. I'll turn to you, Councillor Finley.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor, and I want to be really, really clear that the 6 I pulled out is not because I don't agree with what they do or the benefit they have in our communities nationwide, but from strictly a they can afford it viewpoint. The SPCA has a balance sheet of $120 million. They had a $16 million surplus this year, and they have $25 million in cash. And they're asking for a $7,000 exemption. And so that's the reason I've put this forward, is I believe they can afford it and should afford it. When we're talking just previously about Camp Quanos, that they can afford it, well, surely the SPCA can afford it as well. So I'd like to put the motion forward to deny.
It's been moved. Do we have a seconder? There's no seconder. So we'll move on then to the Red Cross application. I'll turn to you, Councillor Finley. Oh, of course.
I'm sorry, so we just, there was no seconder to deny it, so it's still on the floor to consider.
Okay, so motion to approve. Moved by Councillor Toporowski, seconded by Councillor Stash. All in favor? And opposed? Councillor Finley opposed. The motion carries. Okay, we'll now move on to Red Cross. Over to you, Councillor Finley.
I don't like kittens. Wow, I love kittens. Same idea. You know, the Red Cross does wonderful work across the nation and nationwide. $603 million balance sheet, $65 million in surplus, $244 million in cash or cash equivalents, and they're asking for a $10,000 tax exemption from us. And again, I just think that's unfair to our residents to carry a $10,000 tax exemption when they have $244 million in their bank account. So I would like to put the motion forward to deny the exemption.
It's been moved. Do we have a seconder? No seconder. All right, do we have another motion to adopt the staff recommendation? Moved by Councillor Callio, seconded by Councillor Toporowski. All in favor? And opposed? Councillor Finley opposed. Motion carries. We'll now move on to Ducks Unlimited. Back to you, Councillor Finley.
Same thing. Can we just say ditto?
Right.
Ditto. They got a lot of cash, and I would like to deny their request for an exemption. I'll pass that motion.
Moved. Seconder? No seconder. All right, does someone want to move that we approve the recommendation for 100% exemption? Moved by Councillor Justice, seconded by Councillor Stash. All in favor? And opposed? Councillor Finley opposed. Motion carries. It's up to you, Councillor Finley. We can go through the rest, but do you have a... We can go through each one of them, or we can...
Why don't I do all three at once? How
all
about
three
that?
at once, okay.
Okay, let's do that. So Island Corridor Foundation, $360 million balance sheet. They're asking for $130,000, give or take. I looked at it. Exemption from us. I think that's a lot. Nature Conservancy has $1.2 billion balance sheet with $100 million in cash. They're asking for a $24,000 exemption. Nature Trust of BC has $151 million balance sheet, $1.5 million in cash, asking for an $18,000 exemption. I'd like to move to deny the exemption on all three.
All right, it's been moved. Do we have a seconder?
Can I sever the Island Corridor?
Okay, we'll treat that one as severed. So we'll just talk about Island Corridor Foundation right now. So it's been...
Sorry, can I just confirm, what are we talking about now?
So Councillor Finley moved...
Yes, he moved the three, and you asked for one to be pulled?
Sever the Island Corridor.
But we don't have a seconder yet, so do you want a second?
Oh,
This is getting a bit convoluted. Can we start over?
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to unwind that motion.
yeah,
Yeah.
it hasn't been seconded, so.
Okay.
So I would like to pass the motion to deny the Island Quarter
Island
Foundation.
Quarter Foundation on its own,
On
and
its
you're
own.
willing to second that?
I'm not gonna second that. So-
Okay. No, but you need to second it, because no one else. Okay. Okay, you second the motion, deny the tax exemption for Island Quarter Foundation. Would you like to speak to it further?
Sure, why not, again. $316 million balance sheet, they're asking for $130,000 tax exemption from us. That's almost a quarter of the entire tax exemptions that we have in front of us today. It's enormous, and that's why I would like to deny it.
So it's moved, it's seconded. Any further discussion? Councillor Manhas?
Yeah, I'm gonna,
It's on, it's just kind of fluttering a bit.
I'm gonna vote against the motion because I think the Island Corridor Foundation right now, I think we need rail, we need rail, and they're struggling right now to raise the money in order to get the rail going. Rail could be a big economic boon to Vancouver Island, to transporting our products by train rather than by trucks, and so I'm gonna be supporting. I'm not gonna support your motion.
All right. Let's call the question. All in favor? And opposed? Councillors Justice, Mayor Douglas, Councillors Manhas, Eustache, and Callio are opposed. The motion's defeated. So does someone want to move that we accept the application from Island Quarter Foundation for 100% exemption? Moved by Councillor Manhas, seconded by Councillor Justice. Any discussion? All in favor to approve it? And opposed? Councillor Finley opposed. The motion carries. So now we've got Nature Conservancy and Nature Trust. Do you want to try those as a pair?
Oh,
Save
why
us a
not?
couple minutes?
Let's do
All
it.
right.
Let's try them as a pair. Nature Conservancy, $1.2 billion balance sheet. Nature Trust of BC, $151 million balance sheet. $24,000 for Nature Conservancy in tax exemption and $18,000 for Nature Trust of BC. And I move to deny those exemptions.
So it's been moved. Do we have a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Manhas. Any discussion? Councillor Eustache?
Just a reminder that some of these lands, such as the cross on top of Peepalm, is Nature Conservancy land, and it serves the OCP goals of ecological conservation and preservation of recreation areas.
Thanks for that. Any further comments? So all in favor of the motion to deny the tax exemption application? Councillors Manhas, Callio, and Finley. All those opposed? Sorry? So this meeting's getting pretty convoluted with all these different motions. So it's... Sorry. Yeah, sorry, to deny the tax exemption. Someone want to switch places with me? This is all getting pretty convoluted tonight. So all those in favor to deny the tax exemption as moved by Councillor Finley and seconded by Councillor Manhas? Raise your hand. Okay, we got Councillors Manhas, Callio, and Finley in favor of denying the tax exemption. All those opposed? The Mayor, Councillor Toporowski, Councillor Justice, and Councillor Staff. So the motion's defeated. Do we want to consider a motion to accept the applications from these two organizations? Moved by Councillor Justice, seconded by Councillor Stash. All in favor? And opposed? Councillors Finley, Callio, Manhas opposed. The motion carries. So we'll now move on to the Clement Central Society, and Councillor Manhas and I have relatives either currently or previously employed by this organization, so we're going to recuse ourselves, and I'll turn the chair over to Councillor Toporowski. All right, just Clements.
Mic's on. Okay. I might turn to corporate officer if I get this wrong, but they're out of the room. I'd like to see if there's a motion to accept.
So moved.
So moved. All six? Is it six of them? 6 applications for Clements? Or just say all of them? Five, okay. Moved. Seconded by Finley. All in favor? Against? None against. Okay, it's done. You can call him back in the room.
Okay, so I think that concludes the 2024 permissive tax exemptions applications. Yeah. All right, so we can now move on to new business, and we have a request for a letter of support from the Royal Canadian Legion, Chemainus Branch, number 191. We have a staff recommendation. Mr. Swaby, is there any context staff would like to add, or is it all pretty well laid out in the letter? Yeah. Moved by Councillor Finley, seconded by Councillor Callio. Recommendation, that is. Any discussion? All in favor? And opposed? Motion carries. We'll now move on to question period, and I'll start by asking if there are any members in the public in the gallery who have any questions for council. No, the time limit's only for public input. For question period, I'll say you have as much time as you want, but we want actual questions, and in some
I have a
cases
little preamble, and I definitely have a question at the end of it. I assume it's gonna be 25 to 30 minutes. You good with that? I'm just joking, just joking, just joking. For those of you who haven't had the opportunity to read the business plans coming out of staff over the years, there's a common theme in a lot of the entries where staff are overwhelmed with work. There's no question of it. We put a lot of demands on them. The affordable housing policy, as it's written right now, that's what I'm talking about, no changes to it or anything, will probably start to come into fruition within a year to 5 years. Some of the projects that might come up might be 5 years out. To talk to Councillor Toporowski's point about affordability of 30% of income, that takes a lot of work to administer. There's a lot of work, and that's a means test. That's getting a hold of the clients, that's having a list of clients, managing that client list. And that's just one small portion of this policy, okay? So my question to council is, if you're considering going forward with this, or any portion of this, would you ask staff to give you an estimate of the number of new staff required and the corresponding budgets that would support that, and I'm going to call it a department, okay, between now and maybe 5 years from now? I don't need an answer from you. I just want, that's my question to you. Would you pose that to staff at some point and tell us, the taxpayers, what this affordable policy is going to cost us in the long term?
It's a fair question, and we can certainly ask it. I think the challenge is that even though the policy is quite detailed in the 14 pages included in it, there are a number of sections that it's going to depend on how we implement it. Will have different impacts on staff. So for example, if we are going to require the development applications include a minimum percentage of affordable units, it's one thing if the municipality is responsible for finding tenants and monitoring that they meet certain income thresholds. But it's a whole nother matter if we turn that over to, say, some sort of housing society and work out some kind of housing agreement for that society to manage those units. So again, it's a totally fair question, but a lot of it's going to depend on what direction we decide to go in with implementation, and a lot of that's going to have to come back to council And as you said, there's the business planning process when we often adopt big policies here without necessarily thinking through all the implications. But when we get to that business planning process, that's kind of where the rubber hits the road, and we've got to make those tough decisions on how far we're going to go, because there's all kinds of policies we've adopted at this table, and some of them we've implemented, and some of them have been on a shelf collecting dust for years.
Understood. My concern is, I've been here 21 years and listened to various councillors, various CAOs and staff members. At the 11th hour, here's the budget. Are you going to accept the budget then and say, okay, we're going to add 3 more staff and $2 million to the budget at that point? Or do you want some indication that if it all goes into place, there's going to be an impact down the road? If you get no, I don't know what the word is, if you don't get any acknowledgement from staff as to what the long-term implications are, and they do that, you do 5-year financial planning, you may get caught, because you might have a tax revolt, and I say that generically, but you may get a lot of taxpayers revolting against the notion of adding 4 or 5 staff people to manage this affordable housing policy and everything that comes with it at the 11th hour. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks for the question. All right, I was going to ask IT staff if we have any virtual attendees with their hands raised, but I don't see anyone there.
That's correct, Mr. Mayor. No attendees.
All right, I think that concludes. There is, maybe I'll just turn to the gallery one more time and ask if there are any members of the public who want to step up to the podium. No? All right, well, that concludes our business.